Tonight, as the wind whispers secrets just beyond our hearing, we begin a journey into a world where the sky itself holds prophecies, and one person's courage can challenge the fate of an entire civilization. This is the story of the Storm Speakers, those who predicted the fall of great empires, and it starts with a single, daring climb that defied both gravity and tradition. We'd love to know where you're joining us from for this tale, whether you're listening under a blanket of stars or during your morning commute, and what time your own journey into this myth begins. Feel free to share that in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see how our community stretches across the globe, united by a love for stories that explore the very edges of human courage. High above the world, on a peak known as the Obsidian Spire, a young woman named Lyra fights her way upward. Her fingers are raw, gripping the ancient, rain-slicked stone, each handhold a testament to her desperation. She is an acolyte, a novice in the ancient order of the Storm Speakers, and she is driven by a vision so terrifying it cannot be ignored. In her mind, she has already seen the great city of Ethel fall, its marble towers cracking, its river running red, a shadow swallowing the sun. But a vision is just a dream until it is confirmed by the heavens themselves. She climbs now to witness a celestial alignment, a moment in the sky that will prove whether her sight is true or merely a trick of a fearful mind. The howling wind around her carries more than just the sharp scent of incoming rain. It carries the immense weight of a destiny she is only beginning to understand, setting the stage for a profound conflict between the rigid traditions of her elders and the terrifying truth she feels in her bones. This is more than a simple warning. For Lyra, the goal is to save thousands of lives, but to do so, she must risk everything. Her place within the only home she has ever known, her standing, and potentially her life. If the Elder Storm Speakers declare her prophecy to be heresy, the punishment is exile. Yet she climbs on, because the alternative, staying silent while a city marches blindly toward ruin, is a far greater horror. As she finally pulls herself onto the summit, her body aching and her breath coming in ragged gasps, the sky above her does not calm. Instead, it begins to churn with an unnatural, electric light. This is where our story truly begins, at the precipice of discovery, where one person's conviction is about to challenge the foundations of power and prophecy. It's a tale that asks a timeless question. What do you do when you see a disaster coming, but those in charge refuse to listen? Over the course of this video, we will follow Lyra's incredible journey from a lone, doubting acolyte to a figure who reshapes the destiny of her world. A chronicle filled with danger, betrayal, and the unyielding power of truth. So settle in, because the storm is gathering, and the Chronicle of the Storm Speakers is about to be written anew. And there, on that windswept summit, the vision takes hold of her completely. It is not a gentle seeing, but a violent seizure of the senses. The storm's energy, that crackling power in the air, does not simply surround Lyra. It pours into her, making her body a living conduit for a truth too terrible to bear silently. Her voice, when it comes, is not entirely her own. It is layered with the roar of the gale and the sharp crack of distant thunder. She speaks aloud what she sees, the words ripped from her as if by a force greater than herself. She describes the great marble towers of Ethel, symbols of its power and pride, cracking like eggshells. She speaks of the river, the city's lifeblood, turning a thick and horrifying crimson. And finally, she whispers of a shadow, cold and immense, that rises from the west to swallow the sun itself, plunging the world into an endless twilight. The other acolytes who had gathered on the spire, drawn by the celestial event, watch in a frozen mixture of awe and terror. This is no theoretical exercise. It is a raw, unfiltered prophecy of doom, and Lyra is at its very center. As the last word leaves her lips, the energy abandons her body, leaving her physically spent. She stumbles, her knees buckling on the wet stone, every muscle trembling with a profound exhaustion. But the vision demands a record. With a hand that shakes uncontrollably, she fumbles for a smooth slate and a shard of lightning glass, a material formed when lightning strikes the sand of the high peaks, known for its ability to hold the memory of storm energy. Pressing the sharp point against the stone, she begins to etch. She does not draw a literal scene. Instead, her hand moves almost independently, carving the essential symbols of the cataclysm. A jagged line for the cracking tower, a wavy flow for the tainted river, a spiraling vortex for the devouring shadow. This slate is no longer just a rock. It becomes the first tangible evidence of the prophecy, a physical anchor for a nightmare made real. The reaction among the witnesses is immediate and divisive. Some of the younger acolytes look upon Lyra with a newfound, almost reverent awe. They see in her a connection to the storm, spirits more direct and powerful than anything they have ever witnessed. But others, those more steeped in the Order's cautious traditions, shrink back. Their faces are masks of fear, not fear for the city, but fear of Lyra and the uncontrollable power she has just demonstrated. To them, such a dire vision feels like a corruption, a crack in the proper way of things. This division sows the first seeds of discord within the sacred space of the spire, turning a united order into a collection of uncertain individuals. It is into this charged atmosphere that Elder Kalin arrives. His presence is like a sudden drop in pressure. He does not need to ask what has happened. The electric tension in the air and the stunned silence of the acolytes tell him everything. His eyes, sharp and discerning, sweep over the scene, lingering on the exhausted Lyra and the freshly etched slate in her hands. He does not offer comfort or praise. Instead, his voice cuts through the wind, cold and authoritative. He declares the vision far too dire, too absolute in its despair. In the strict doctrines of the storm speakers, he explains, such overwhelming negativity can be a sign of a corrupted connection, a warning that the seer's own fears may be twisting the messages from the storm spirits, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of doom. With this single pronouncement, he creates a chasm between Lyra's unshakable, first-hand certainty and the Elder's institutional caution. The conflict is no longer theoretical. It is personified in the space between the trembling acolyte and the imposing Elder. Lyra stands at a crossroads, her body weak but her spirit bristling. She can submit to Kalin's scrutiny, allow the elders to dissect her vision, and potentially dismiss it as a youthful aberration. This is the safe path, the obedient path, or she can listen to the chilling clarity that still echoes in her bones, the undeniable truth of what she saw. In a moment that will define her entire journey, she makes her choice. She lowers her eyes, a gesture of seeming submission, and agrees that the vision was perhaps overwhelming. She hides the true depth of her conviction, masking her fears behind a veil of dutiful uncertainty. This is not surrender, it is her first act of defiance. By choosing to secretly investigate the vision's meaning on her own terms, she steps away from the protective community of the Order and onto a solitary, dangerous path. The personal stakes of her standing within the storm speakers are now irrevocably tied to the fate of a city she believes is living on borrowed time. And as the others begin to descend the spire, the gathering clouds overhead seem not just to watch, but to bear silent witness to the birth of a rebellion. The summons comes not with a shout, but with a silent, heavy expectation that settles over Lyra's small chamber like a blanket of stone. She is to appear before the full conclave of storm speakers. The journey to their meeting place, a chamber carved directly into the heart of the mountain, feels like a walk to her own trial. The air grows colder the deeper she goes, the rough-hewn granite walls absorbing all sound, until the only thing she can hear is the frantic beating of her own heart. When the massive stone doors swing open, she steps into a vast, circular room where the elders sit in a tiered semicircle, their faces illuminated by the cool, steady light of glow mosses cultivated in niches along the walls. The atmosphere is not one of welcome, but of severe judgment. Elder Kalin presides from the central seat, his expression as unyielding as the rock around them. To his right sits Elder Myron, her demeanor notably different. Where Kalin's gaze is like a hammer, Myron's is more like a probe, thoughtful and measuring. Lyra is instructed to stand in the center of the chamber, on a specific mosaic depicting a storm cloud pierced by a single bolt of lightning. It is the traditional place for acolytes presenting their first major prophecies, but today it feels less like a platform and more like a target. She is commanded to recount her vision, and as she speaks the words again, the cracking towers, the blood-red river, the devouring shadow, they echo in the immense silence, each one landing with a weight that seems to make the very mountain shudder. The questioning begins immediately, and it is Kalin who leads the assault. His voice is calm, which makes his words all the more cutting. He does not call her a liar. He is far too sophisticated for that. Instead, he questions the purity of her connection. Acolyte Lyra, he begins. The visions granted by the storm spirits are often complex, layered with metaphor. Are you certain your own fears, perhaps stirred by tales of ancient falls, did not color this reading? Could the shadow not simply represent a season of poor harvests, and the cracking towers a metaphor for political unrest? Each question is designed to shrink her prophecy, to reduce a cataclysm into a manageable, mundane problem. He forces her to defend not just what she saw, but her very ability to see it, planting seeds of doubt that find fertile ground in her own mind. Is it possible? Could the terrifying certainty she felt have been a trick of her own anxiety? Then, Elder Myron speaks. Her tone is softer, but no less intense. Lyra, the scale of what you describe is unprecedented in our recent histories. The Conclave's duty is to protect the people from panic as much as from peril. Can you point to any earthly signs, any tangible evidence that aligns with this vision? A prophecy of this magnitude cannot exist in a vacuum. Myron's line of inquiry is different. She does not dismiss the vision outright, but she appeals to Lyra's reason, asking for proof that Lyra, in her raw, spiritual state, simply does not have. The conflict is no longer just between Lyra and Kalin. It is now internal, a civil war within her own soul, between the unshakable feeling in her gut and the crushing weight of logical scrutiny from her most respected elders. The debate among the Conclave members that follows is hushed and tense. It becomes clear that the council is hopelessly deadlocked. Some elders side with Kalin, arguing that to give credence to such a dire prediction without ironclad proof would be irresponsible, potentially causing the very chaos it foretells. Others, swayed by the raw power of Lyra's account and Myron's cautious support, argue that to ignore it would be a catastrophic betrayal of their order's core purpose. They cannot ignore a prophecy, but its terrifying scale paralyzes them with fear. The solution they settle on is a classic political compromise, one that satisfies the process without addressing the problem. They will not dismiss Lyra, nor will they act on her warning. Instead, she is to be assigned a mentor. The name spoken aloud sends a new kind of chill through the chamber. Ronan. He is a figure spoken of in whispers, a storm speaker of immense former promise, who has become disillusioned and reclusive. He does not sit with the other elders. He stands in the shadows of the chamber, a man apart. Assigning him to guide Lyra is a move layered with meaning. Officially, it is a gesture of support, providing a young seer with experienced counsel. But Lyra understands the truth instantly. This is not guidance, it is surveillance. Ronan is to be her keeper, tasked with monitoring her every thought and ensuring her radical ideas do not further disrupt the order. Her reputation and her freedom within the spire are now formally and precariously on the line. As the session is dismissed, Ronan approaches her for the first time. He does not look at her with pity or with sternness, but with a deep, weary resignation. His first words are not a greeting or an instruction. They are a low, cryptic murmur meant for her ears alone. "They believe they are giving you a teacher," he says, his eyes holding a universe of past pain. "But remember, child, the truth has a price, and it is never the one you expect to pay." With that, he turns and walks away, leaving Lyra standing alone in the stone chamber. In that moment, she makes her most crucial decision yet. She will outwardly accept the council's decree. She will play the role of the chastened acolyte, grateful for the guidance. But inwardly, Ronan's warning only solidifies her resolve. She will prove herself right, even if it means learning to lie, to hide her intentions, and to navigate the treacherous currents of the spire with a duplicity she never knew she possessed. The political stakes have been revealed, and she is now a player in a dangerous game she did not choose. Their first session begins not with words, but with a long, silent walk deep into the mountain's heart. Ronan leads the way, a single lantern casting shifting shadows on the tunnel walls, his silence a wall as solid as the granite around them. Lyra follows, her mind racing with 1,000 questions she dares not ask. The air grows still and cool, smelling of old parchment and stone dust, until they arrive at a pair of immense bronze doors, green with age. These are the doors to the archives of echoes. With a low groan, Ronan pushes one open, and Lyra steps into a cavern so vast the ceiling is lost in darkness. It is not a library as she imagined. It is a catacomb of knowledge. Endless shelves, carved directly from the living rock, stretch away into the gloom, each one laden not with books, but with thousands of smooth, dark slate tablets, identical to the one she used to record her own vision. Each slate is a tombstone for a lost world, a silent scream from a storm speaker who saw the end coming. Ronan's voice, when it finally comes, is flat and devoid of the reverence she expects for such a place. He gestures to the seemingly infinite collection. Your task is not to obsess over your own prophecy. He instructs, his tone making it clear this is a command, not a suggestion. That is a circle that leads only to madness. Your task is to understand the pattern. Look there, he says, pointing to a specific section, the agricultural empire of the sun blessed. And over there, the mountain fortress of the Iron Kings. Study how their falls began. Look for the warnings that were given, and more importantly, look for how those warnings were received. His method is brutally logical. He wants her to see her own terrifying vision, not as a unique event, but as part of a recurring cycle in history, a disease that civilizations seem contract again and again. It is a lesson in humility, designed to shrink her personal crisis into a historical footnote. And so, Lyra begins her work. For days that blend into one another, she moves through the cool, silent aisles, her fingers tracing the etched symbols on ancient slates. She reads the prophecies of speakers long turned to dust, and a chilling pattern emerges with terrifying clarity. It was never a lack of warning that doomed these empires. Time and again, a storm speaker would emerge, their vision clear and desperate, speaking of pride before a fall, of cracks in the foundation, of a shadow on the horizon. And time and again, the ruling powers of those civilizations did the same thing. They dismissed the messenger. They called the prophecies madness, treason, or the ravings of an unbalanced mind. They prioritized short-term stability over long-term survival, silencing the voices that spoke uncomfortable truths. This knowledge is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it fuels her resolve, proving she is not alone, that her fear is a legacy shared by the most gifted seers across the ages. On the other hand, it deepens her dread into a profound despair. If every great culture had its Lyra, and every one of them fell anyway, what hope does Ethel possibly have? This grim education creates a simmering internal conflict within her. She cannot help but respect Ronan's vast, deep knowledge. His insights into the archives are sharp. He can point her to a specific tablet that illustrates a political suppression tactic used by the Sun-Blessed that mirrors the Conclave's own cautious inaction. He is a brilliant teacher, but with every passing day, Lyra becomes more convinced that he is hiding something crucial. The weariness in his eyes seems too personal, too specific. When he speaks of speakers whose warnings were ignored, there is a pain in his voice that feels less like scholarly empathy and more like a lived memory. She begins to suspect that his disillusionment is not born from abstract philosophy, but from a direct, personal failure, that he, too, once stood where she stands now, and that his story did not have a happy ending. Their dynamic becomes a tense, unspoken dance. He is the master, imparting wisdom designed to temper her. She is the student, absorbing the lessons while secretly searching for the key he might be withholding. This tension finally snaps her patience. Ronan's instruction to ignore her own vision starts to feel less like wise guidance and more like an intentional diversion. What if the key to saving Ethel is not just in the general pattern, but in the specific symbols of her prophecy. Trusting her own instincts over his cautious authority, she makes a fateful decision. Late one evening, when the archives are empty and the only light is from her solitary lantern, she takes a great risk. She finds a secluded alcove and unrolls a blank piece of vellum. Onto it, she carefully copies the 3 core symbols from her own slate: the jagged crack, the tainted river, the devouring shadow. Then, heart-pounding, she begins the painstaking work of cross, referencing them against the archives, tablet by tablet, looking for an exact match. It is a direct violation of Ronan's command, an act of scholarly rebellion that feels both terrifying and utterly necessary. The work is slow, the silence of the archives pressing in on her. She scans thousands of etchings, her eyes straining in the dim light, seeing variations on themes of collapse, but nothing precise. Just as despair begins to set in, her lantern flickers over a slate from a section marked for the maritime kingdom of Thalassar, a civilization said to have sunk beneath the waves in a single storm-racked night. And there it is. Among the symbols of swirling whirlpools and shattered ships, she finds one that makes her blood run cold. It is not the jagged crack or the shadow, but a symbol she had almost overlooked in her own vision: a serpent, coiled perfectly, eating its own tail. The archivists of Thalassar had labeled it the Ouroboros of Pride, the symbol of a system so consumed by its own success that it engineered its own destruction. In that moment, the stakes of her solitary mission evolve completely. This is no longer just about personal vindication or even saving her own city. It is about breaking a historical curse. She is walking a path that has led countless other storm speakers to ruin, and the dust of ages, clinging to her fingers, feels like the weight of every civilization that ever refused to listen. The discovery in the archives ignites a fire in Lyra's mind, a desperate need to see the connection with her own eyes. She waits for a day when Ronan is occupied with Conclave business, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs as she makes her way down from the isolated spire and into the bustling heart of Ethel itself. The city is a riot of noise and color, a stark contrast to the silent, dusty world of slates and symbols. Her destination is the city's newest pride, the great bridge that spans the river Etha, a marvel of engineering meant to symbolize Ethel's unshakable prosperity and its dominance over the natural world. As she approaches, the scale of it is overwhelming, a sweeping arc of pale stone, adorned with statues of merchants and counselors, their faces turned toward a future of endless growth. She walks its length slowly, her eyes not on the panoramic views or the busy traffic, but on the details, scanning the carved balustrades and the ornate pylons. At first, she sees nothing but the official iconography, sheaves of wheat for abundance, interlocking gears for industry, the stylized sun of the city crest. It all speaks of controlled, sanctioned pride. But then, as she reaches the central span, her breath catches in her throat. There, woven into the intricate stonework near the base of the largest statue, is a pattern so subtle it would be missed by any casual observer. It is a frieze depicting the river's bounty, with fish and reeds and flowing water, and within the curling waves, almost hidden, is the unmistakable form, a serpent, its body elegantly coiled, its tail disappearing into its own mouth. The Ouroboros, it is not presented as a warning, It is celebrated as a decorative motif, a symbol of eternal cycle and renewal, completely missing the grim irony that the Thalassar records had assigned to it. This single, chilling detail changes everything. The terror that floods Lyra is colder and more profound than any she felt during her initial vision. A natural disaster, a storm, or an earthquake is a force from outside. It can be feared, perhaps even weathered, but this suggests the doom is not an external event waiting to happen. It is a flaw woven directly into the city's very identity, a cancer of pride growing silently within its greatest achievement. The prophecy is not a future possibility. It is a present reality, already in motion. The bridge is no longer just a bridge. It is a monument to the same blindness that sank Thalassar. The conflict shifts inside her, transforming from a struggle against skeptical elders into a race against a hidden, insidious enemy, the city's own unchecked ambition, a force far more difficult to fight than any storm. The pressure of time becomes a physical weight on her shoulders. Every cart that rumbles across the bridge, every citizen who admires its grandeur, feels like another grain of sand falling in an hourglass. She understands now that the Conclave's cautious debates are a luxury the city cannot afford. Going back to them with just a story, with a parallel between an ancient symbol and a modern decoration, will achieve nothing. Kalin would dismiss it as coincidence, a fanciful interpretation by an over-imaginative acolyte. To have any hope of making them listen, of shocking them into action, she needs something they cannot ignore. She needs physical, tangible proof that the connection to Thalassar's fall is more than symbolic, that the same reckless principles that doomed one civilization are actively at work in the very foundations of their own. This realization forces a critical decision, the most dangerous one of her young life. She cannot simply report her findings. She must investigate them herself. This means planning a risky, completely unauthorized journey to the bridge's foundations, to the support pylons that descend into the dark water and the riverbed below. It is a venture far outside the bounds of an acolyte's duties, a direct violation of the trust placed in her, even as a supervised one. If she is caught, the charge will no longer be mere insubordination. It will be trespassing on a vital city structure, an act that could be construed as sabotage. She is moving from the realm of scholarly rebellion into active, physical investigation, exchanging the safety of the archives for the palpable dangers of the city's underbelly. The Grand Bridge, once a symbol of Ethel's bright future, now looms over her like a beautiful, intricate trap, and she knows she must walk directly into its jaws if she is to have any chance of springing it before it closes on the entire city. Leaving the silent, imposing shadow of the obsidian spire felt like stepping onto an alien world. For Lyra, whose life had been defined by ritual, study, and the whispering winds of the high peaks, the lower markets of Ethel were an overwhelming assault on every sense. The air, once thin and clean, was now thick with the smells of sizzling meat, overripe fruit, and the sharp tang of unwashed bodies. The orderly hum of chanted prayers was replaced by a chaotic symphony of haggling merchants, braying pack animals, and the shrieks of playing children. Dressed in a simple, homespun tunic she had bartered for with a stray silver pin, she was no longer acolyte Lyra of the Storm Speakers. She was just another face in the crowd, her status and identity rendered utterly meaningless. This anonymity was her shield, but it also bred a new, gnawing fear. Every jostle from a passerby felt intentional. Every glance held a flicker of recognition she knew was just her own paranoia. The safety of the ivory tower was gone, replaced by the raw, unpredictable energy of the city she was trying to save. Her goal was a needle in this teeming haystack, to find the artisans, the stone masons and laborers who had actually built the Great Bridge. The official records in the spire spoke of architects and guild masters, but Lyra knew the truth was often found in the whispers of those who mixed the mortar and laid the stone. She moved through the crowded aisles, her ears straining to pick out useful conversations from the meaningless noise. She heard arguments over prices, boasts about harvests, and gossip about city councilors, but nothing about the bridge. The workers she did see, their hands still stained with dust, and their shoulders permanently stooped from heavy loads, were clustered in tight groups, their conversations low and guarded. They were not like the open, gossipy merchants. They were closed off, a community unto themselves, and gaining their trust would be impossible for an outsider. Frustration began to prickle at her. Time was a luxury she did not have, and this passive listening was yielding nothing. She needed to create an opportunity, a moment of chaos that would force a revelation. Spotting a group of masons taking a break near a stall piled high with delicate, glazed pottery, an idea formed, born of desperation and a careful application of her gift. She focused her mind not on a great gale, but on the smallest breath of air. With a subtle flick of her wrist, hidden within the fold of her tunic, she directed a tiny, controlled gust. It was just enough to catch the edge of a precariously stacked bowl. The effect was instantaneous. The bowl teetered for a heart, stopping second, before crashing to the cobblestones, its shards skittering across the ground. The merchant erupted in a fury, his shouts drawing the attention of everyone nearby, including the group of masons. In that moment of shared distraction, as all eyes turned to the commotion, Lyra melted into the background, edging close enough to hear the masons' hushed conversation. Their talk, which had ceased when she approached, resumed now that the focus was elsewhere. Told you it was unstable, one man muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Felt it in the pylons, a shudder that wasn't right. Another grunted in agreement. Aye, and that stone, that black stone they brought in for the deep work. Slick as ice and cold as a winter grave. Never felt anything like it. Wasn't from the king's quarry, that's for certain. The words were fragmented, fearful, and they stopped abruptly as one of the men noticed Lyra, standing a little too close. Their eyes met, and in his gaze, she saw not curiosity, but a flash of warning and fear before he quickly turned away, pulling his companions with him as they disappeared into the crowd. The encounter lasted only seconds, but it changed everything. The vague symbols of her prophecy, the cracking tower, the unstable earth now had a tangible, physical cause. It wasn't just pride or a historical pattern. It was a specific, strange material, a black stone that defied description, secretly used in the most critical part of the bridge's construction. This was no longer a matter of misinterpreted omens. This was evidence of something deliberately wrong. The conflict within her sharpened. The external danger was now clear. She was asking questions about something powerful people wanted kept secret. But the internal tension, the paranoia, also intensified. That mason's fearful look confirmed it. She was not just being cautious. She was being watched, or at the very least, treading on ground that ordinary people knew was dangerous. Standing there in the bustling market, the scent of strange spices and the palpable fear from the masons hanging thick in the air, Lyra made her next critical decision. Returning to the spire with this hearsay was pointless. She needed to follow the trail to its source. She had to track down the origin of this mysterious void rock, as the masons had called it. This decision pulled her irrevocably away from the theoretical world of the archives and into the gritty, dangerous underworld of Ethel's commerce and secrets. The mystery had deepened from a spiritual warning into a potential conspiracy, introducing the possibility of a saboteur or a catastrophic engineering flaw born of greed. Her solitary investigation was no longer just about proving a vision. It was a hunt for a physical truth, and with every step she took away from the market, the personal danger grew, leading her away from the crowded center and toward the dust-choked, secretive world of the quarries. The trail of the mysterious black stone led Lyra away from the noisy markets and into the quieter, more residential districts of Ethel, where the houses were smaller and the air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. It was here, after discreet inquiries with a sympathetic water carrier who remembered the bridge construction, that she found the home of Bram, a stone cutter now retired by a bad back and old age. His small cottage sat at the end of a muddy lane, its garden overgrown, a tangible reflection of a life lived on the margins after the great work was done. Approaching his door, Lyra felt a fresh wave of that now familiar conflict. This was not an elder in a granite hall or a guarded mason in a crowd. This was a vulnerable man, and the tool she planned to use felt uncomfortably like a violation. She found him sitting on a stool outside his door, aimlessly whittling a piece of soft wood, his gnarled hands moving with a slow, practiced rhythm. His eyes, when they looked up at her, were clouded with the milky haze of cataracts, but they held a deep-seated wariness. Lyra introduced herself not as a storm speaker, but as a scholar studying the city's great structures, a half-truth that felt bitter on her tongue. Bram was polite but dismissive at first, his answers short. "The bridge is built," he grumbled. "What's done is done. I've no more stories to tell about it." The wall was up. She needed a key, and the only one she had was her gift. Taking a slow, steadying breath, she did not summon a storm, but something far more subtle. As she spoke again, asking him about the feel of the stone, the texture under his tools, she gently pulled the moisture from the air around them. A soft, cool mist began to gather, not a thick fog, but a gentle haze that wrapped around the two of them, blurring the sharp edges of the world beyond. It was a minor manipulation, but its effect was profound. The mist created a pocket of intimacy, a private world where whispers felt safe and memories felt closer. It was a manipulation of atmosphere, and in doing so, a manipulation of trust, and it worked. Bram's shoulders, which had been tense, slowly relaxed. He blinked, looking around at the soft, gray world the mist had made, and then his gaze returned to Lyra, seeming to truly see her for the first time. The wariness in his eyes softened into a profound, weary sadness. "The stone," he said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone. "You ask about the stone. I felt many stones in my day, girl, warm granite from the northern hills, gritty sandstone from the east. But that stone, that was different. He described how, deep in the foundation work, the regular quarry stone had been replaced for the central pylons. The new material was brought in on covered wagons under the cloak of night, handled by men who spoke little and watched everyone. He was ordered to shape it, and his first touch sent a jolt through him. It was cold, he whispered, his whittling knife stilling in his hand. Not the cold of a winter morning, but a deep cold, like touching something that had never known the sun. And it was hungry. He explained that the black stone, which they called void rock, seemed to drink the sound from the air, making the work site eerily quiet. It swallowed the light from their torches, creating pockets of absolute darkness that felt heavier than any shadow. Then came the most damning part of his tale. The guild masters, he said, his voice trembling slightly. The merchant guild, they were the ones who brought it. Their foreman paid each of us a purse of silver, real silver, more than I'd seen in a year. And he looked each man in the eye as he did it. He said this stone was a new marvel, a secret that would make the bridge last 1,000 years. But then he said the price for talking would be far higher than the reward for silence. He fell silent then, staring at his hands as if he could still see the silver coins and feel the chilling weight of the threat. The confession hung in the misty air between them, a secret held for years finally released. In that moment, Lyra's understanding of the threat shattered and reformed. This was no longer a story about a flawed design or a proud symbol. This was a conspiracy. The city's own leaders, the powerful merchant guild who championed progress and prosperity, had knowingly planted a corrupt, unnatural heart into the city's greatest achievement. The external conflict was now terrifyingly clear. She was not fighting a vague spiritual doom, but a deliberate, calculated act of corruption by a wealthy and ruthless enemy. And as the reality of the conspiracy settled over her, so too did a sharp, internal shame. She looked at Bram, an old man now living in a crumbling cottage, haunted by a secret he was paid to keep. She had used her sacred gift, the power to commune with the vast spirit of the storm, to create a little mist and trick a frightened old man into reliving his trauma. The ethical conflict was acute. Was any information, even information that could save a city, worth obtaining through such manipulation? The ends, she tried to tell herself, justify the means. But the uneasy feeling in her stomach, the sense that she was becoming more like the duplicitous forces she fought, would not quiet down. Her goal had justified a small betrayal, and she wondered what larger betrayals might lie ahead. With this grim new knowledge, her path forward became obvious, yet more dangerous than ever. The Merchant Guild was the undeniable key. They possessed the answers, where the void rock came from, why they used it, and what they knew of its true nature. Simply presenting Bram's story to the Conclave would be useless. The guild's influence was vast, and they would easily discredit a retired stonecutter as a senile old man dreaming up stories for attention. She needed something more. She needed to get inside, to find a crack in the guild's formidable armor. This meant she would have to find a way to infiltrate their ranks, or more realistically, seek out a disgruntled member, someone within the guild who had a conscience or a grudge, a person willing to risk everything for the truth. It was a desperate plan, a search for a single honest soul in a den of serpents. As she stood to leave, the mist beginning to dissipate as she released her focus, Bram looked up at her one last time. His fear had returned, but it was now mixed with a flicker of desperate hope. He didn't ask her who she really was. He seemed to understand that some questions were better left unspoken. Instead, with a hand that shook not from age alone, he pointed a crooked finger away from his lane, toward the city's prosperous center. Their house, he murmured, is a fortress of stone and gold near the old forum. You'll know it by the twin marble hounds at its gate. With those words, the stakes were irrevocably raised. The enemy was no longer an abstract concept or a historical pattern. It had a name and an address. The spiritual doom had transformed into a deliberate act of sabotage by the city's most powerful citizens, and the lonely path Lyra walked now led directly to their heavily guarded doorstep. The silence in Lyra's chamber was a heavy thing, broken only by the faint, ever-present sigh of the wind around the obsidian spire. It was in this quiet that a soft, almost tentative knock landed on her door, a sound so out of place it made her jump. She had expected solitude, time to grapple with the terrifying truth Bram had given her the confirmation that the Merchant Guild had knowingly poisoned the city's foundations. When she opened the door, the last person she anticipated to see was Ronan. He stood there, not as the stern, disillusioned mentor from the archives, but as a shadow filled with a grim purpose. He did not wait for an invitation. He simply stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room with a practiced wariness before settling on her. He carried no scrolls, offered no lectures. Instead, he held out his hand. Resting on his palm was an object that seemed to swallow the dim light of the room. It was a compass, but unlike any used for navigation. Its casing was a tarnished, silver-like metal, etched with spiraling patterns that resembled frozen whirlwinds. The needle was not a simple arrow, but a sliver of a dark, crystalline material that seemed to hold a faint, internal glow. This belonged to the speakers who chronicled the fall of the Sun Blessed, Ronan said, his voice low and devoid of its usual weary dismissiveness. He placed it gently into her hesitant hands. It does not point to the North Star. It points toward dissonance, toward concentrations of energy that are unstable, unnatural. It will lead you to the source of the corruption, not just its symptoms. The weight of the object in her hand was more than physical. It was the weight of history, of trust offered from most unexpected quarter. This was not the action of a watchdog assigned to curb her curiosity. This was the act of a fellow seeker, arming her for a hunt. The surprise of it momentarily stripped away her defenses, complicating her view of him in an instant. The man she had suspected of hiding a painful failure was now handing her a key that could unlock the very mystery he was supposedly tasked with keeping her from. But as her initial shock subsided, a colder, more familiar tension took its place. The internal conflict within her shifted dramatically. Was this a genuine offer of help, a secret alliance against the blindness of the Conclave? Or was it an elaborate trap, a way to lead her into a mistake that would justify the elders finally silencing her for good? The trust between them, never strong, was now a fragile, newly spun thread, stretched taut over a chasm of doubt. Ronan seemed to sense her hesitation. His next words were not a reassurance, but a chilling confirmation of her deepest fears. The guild is protected by more than just gold and influence. Lyra, he warned, his gaze intense. They have allies, those who understand the old arts, not for creation, but for obfuscation. There are those who can cloud the visions of the storm speakers, who can weave illusions into the very currents of the air. Your gift, your sight, may not be reliable against them. This, he said, nodding toward the compass, this does not rely on vision. It feels the sickness in the world's skin. Trust it when you can no longer trust your own eyes. With that, he turned to leave, pausing only at the door to deliver a final, somber look. The path you are on is darker than you know. Watch your steps. Left alone once more, Lyra stared at the compass in her hand. The conflict was no longer just about a physical conspiracy. It had escalated into a metaphysical war. The guild's corruption was not merely greed. It was aided by a sinister, magical opposition that actively fought against the Storm Speaker's abilities. This raised the stakes to an entirely new level. The threat was not just aware of them, it was equipped to counter their greatest strength. Her decision was a delicate balancing act. Outright rejection of Ronan's gift would be foolish. The tool was too potent, too specific to be anything but genuine. Yet, blind acceptance could be suicidal. She decided on a path of cautious verification. She would accept the compass, but she would test its function herself, in a controlled way, before staking her life on its guidance. As she held the ancient device, its crystalline needle, which had been still, suddenly gave a faint, almost imperceptible twitch. It wasn't a spin, just a nervous shudder, as if sensing something wrong in the very air of her room. The implication was terrifying. If the needle could twitch here, in the heart of the Storm Speaker's sanctum, then the corruption, the unstable energy of the void rock, had a reach far greater than she had imagined. Its influence was seeping into the city, a poison on the wind. The simple, cold metal in her hand now felt like the only solid truth in a world where even her own senses could not be trusted, and the quiet of her chamber suddenly felt like the calm before an unimaginable storm. The ancient compass became her only guide, a nervous tremor in her palm that grew into a frantic, spinning dance the moment she stepped into the city's financial district. Here, the air itself felt different, thick with the scent of coin and ambition. The grand buildings of pale limestone standing in stark, silent judgment over the crowded streets. Lyra moved like a ghost through the bustling merchants and clerks, her plain clothes a perfect camouflage, her entire being focused on the wild oscillations of the needle. It led her away from the main thoroughfares, down a narrow, grimy alley that smelled of damp rot and forgotten things, to a nondescript building whose only notable feature was a heavy, iron-banded door and the subtle, chilling sensation that made the hairs on her arm stand on end. This was the place, a guild warehouse, masquerading as just another storage facility, its ordinary exterior hiding a terrible secret. Waiting for nightfall was an exercise in agonizing patience. She found a shadowed alcove across from the warehouse, the cold stone seeping through her clothes as she watched the comings and goings. A shift change occurred as the sun dipped below the rooftops. 2 bored-looking guards were replaced by 2 others, their posture just as lax, confident in the unspoken power of the guild's name to deter any trouble. This was her moment. Closing her eyes, Lyra reached out with her spirit, not for a great storm, but for the moisture hanging in the evening air. She pulled it gently toward her, coaxing it from the river and the damp cobblestones, weaving it into a thick, clinging fog that rolled silently down the alleyway. It was a delicate operation, a whisper of power that still carried a risk of detection, but it was her only way in. Within minutes, the world dissolved into a swirling gray blanket, reducing visibility to mere feet and muffling all sound into a soft, deadened hush. Slipping from her hiding place, she became one with the mist. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the eerie quiet. She edged along the warehouse wall, her fingers finding the rough texture of the stone until they brushed against a smaller, less fortified door, a delivery entrance, likely bolted from within. But the fog was her ally in more ways than one. The moisture had swollen the old wood, and with a focused application of pressure, a subtle push of air, she felt the bolt shift just enough in its housing. A sharp, quiet crack echoed, and the door swung inward a few inches. The external conflict was immediate and visceral. Every creak of the floorboards under her feet sounded like a thunderclap. Every distant footfall of a guard on the main street sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. It was a nerve-shredding game of cat and mouse, where she was both the hunter and the prey, moving on instinct through the impenetrable gloom. Inside, the warehouse was a cavern of shadows, the fog she had created seeping in behind her to blend with the natural darkness. The compass in her hand was now useless, its needle spinning in a continuous, dizzying circle, confirming that the entire space was saturated with the same unstable energy. Then she saw them, stacked in neat, ominous rows were dozens of crates, their lids pried open slightly. Even in the near-total blackness, the material within seemed to absorb what little light existed, creating voids deeper than shadow. She approached the nearest crate, her breath catching in her throat. Reaching inside, her fingers closed around a shard of the black stone. The contact was a shock. It was unnaturally cold, a deep, soul-chilling cold that seemed to leach the warmth directly from her blood, and it was silent. When she tapped it lightly against the wooden crate, it made no sound. It simply deadened the impact, as if the very vibration of existence was being swallowed by its absolute stillness. This was the void rock. This was the poison in Ethel's heart. Her horror deepened as her eyes adjusted, and she noticed a small, makeshift desk tucked away in a corner. On it lay a heavy, leather-bound ledger. Risking a sliver of light from a covered lantern on the desk, she flipped it open. The pages were filled with meticulous script, detailing shipments. Her eyes scanned the entries, her blood running colder with each line. The origin point was not a local quarry or a neighboring kingdom. It was a place she knew only from forbidden texts and terrifying legends. The accursed peaks of Xylos, a mountain range said to be haunted, a place where the very laws of nature broke down and from which no expedition had ever returned. The stone had a name, written over and over again with bureaucratic indifference: Void Rock. The entries noted its properties: high density, acoustic dampening, resonant instability, as if it were just another trade good, not a material that threatened to unravel the fabric of reality. The scale of the deception was no longer a suspicion. It was a documented fact. The guild hadn't just stumbled upon a strange stone. They had deliberately journeyed into a damned place to harvest it, knowing full well what it was. This left her with an impossible choice. The ledger was the ultimate proof, a direct link from the cursed mountains to the guild's doorstep. But it was massive, impossible to conceal, and its absence would be discovered instantly, sealing her fate and ending her investigation before it could truly begin. She had to be smarter. Crouching by the dim light, she began to commit the most damning details to memory: the dates of the last 3 shipments, the name of the ship, the sea serpent that carried them, and the specific guild master, a man named Torvin, who had signed for the cargo. It was a fragile form of evidence, just words in her mind, easily dismissed as lies. She needed something tangible. Her gaze fell back on the open crate of void rock. The decision was as risky as it was necessary. She selected a small, sharp shard, no larger than her thumb, and wrapped it tightly in a scrap of cloth from her pocket. It was evidence she could carry, a piece of the corruption itself, but it was also a beacon. If the guild had any way of tracking their cursed material, this shard in her pocket would lead them directly to her. Slipping back out into the fog-shrouded night, the weight of the tiny stone fragment felt immense. It was no longer just a rock. It was a key that unlocked the truth, but also a shackle that bound her to the consequences of that truth. The stakes had escalated from a battle of ideas to a very physical, very dangerous possession of proof. She now held undeniable evidence that the corruption was a deliberate, calculated import. The guild's shadow was not one of mere greed, but of a conscious decision to risk the entire city for a purpose she still could not fathom. The cold of the shard seeped through the cloth and into her skin, a constant, grim reminder that she was now carrying a piece of death itself, and that discovery would mean not just exile, but a silent, permanent disappearance into the guild's unforgiving shadow. The cold, silent weight of the void rock shard in her pocket felt like a burning coal as Lyra marched through the granite corridors of the spire. The evidence she carried was no longer a secret to be investigated, but a truth that demanded to be shouted from the highest peak. She could feel the thrum of power from a conclave session radiating from the great chamber ahead, the collective will of the storm speakers gathered in their customary circle. This was no time for protocol or patience. The memory of Bram's fearful eyes and the ledger's damning entries propelled her forward, with a final, steadying breath that did little to calm the storm in her own heart. She ignored the startled acolyte guarding the door and pushed the massive stone slab open, stepping into the sacred space uninvited and unannounced. Every face in the tiered semicircle turned toward her, a sea of expressions ranging from shock to outright disapproval. The rhythmic hum of debate died instantly, replaced by a silence so profound she could hear her own pulse roaring in her ears. She did not wait for permission to speak. The moment was hers to seize or lose forever. Holding the cloth-wrapped shard aloft, her voice, though young, did not tremble. Elders of the Conclave, she began, her words cutting through the stunned quiet. You debate theoretical dangers while a real one eats away at our city's foundations. With deliberate slowness, she unwrapped the fragment of void rock, its unnatural darkness seeming to drink the light from the glow mosses on the walls. She presented it not as a supplicant, but as an accuser, detailing her journey from the archives of echoes to the guild's warehouse, drawing the direct, terrifying line from the serpent symbol of fallen Thalassar to the corrupt stone in the bridge's heart. The reaction was not unified, but a rupture. Elder Kalin was on his feet in an instant, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. His voice, when it came, was like cracking ice. This is an outrage. You violate our most sacred traditions. Acolyte Lyra, you present a piece of strange ore and a fanciful tale of conspiracies, gathered through deceit and trespass. He dismissed the shard with a wave of his hand, calling it a geological curiosity, a mere black rock that proved nothing. He attacked not the evidence, but the messenger, framing her actions as a greater threat to the Order's stability than any vague prophecy. His was the voice of entrenched power, terrified of the chaos that truth can unleash. But as Lyra's gaze swept the room, she saw that his was not the only response. Elder Myron had not risen, but she had gone pale, her hands gripping the arms of her stone chair. Her eyes were fixed on the void rock shard, and in them, Lyra saw not dismissal, but a dawning, horrified recognition. A few of the younger elders around her exchanged uneasy glances, their faith in the Conclave's infallibility visibly shaken. The chamber was splitting before her eyes, divided between those who, like Kalin, feared the disruption of the truth, and those who, like Myron, were beginning to fear the consequences of ignoring it. And then there was Ronan. He stood in his usual place in the shadows, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable slate. He offered no support, no condemnation. His silence was a void deeper than the rock she held, and in that moment, it felt like the heaviest weight of all. Kalin, seeing the fissure forming, moved swiftly to contain the damage. His authority reasserted itself in a decree that brooked no argument. Your reckless actions have endangered this order and violated our covenant, he declared, his voice echoing with finality. You are hereby confined to your chambers until this matter can be properly adjudicated. You will speak to no one. Consider yourself isolated from the community of the Spire until you learn the meaning of obedience. With a gesture from him, 2 senior storm speakers moved to flank Lyra, their postures making it clear that this was not a request. The confrontation was over. She had forced the truth into the open, and the consequence was not enlightenment, but a cage. The walk back to her chamber was a funeral procession. The once familiar corridors of her home now felt like the walls of a prison. As the heavy lock clicked into place on her door, the full weight of her isolation crashed down upon her. House arrest within the Spire was a subtle, cruel punishment. She was surrounded by the only family she had ever known, yet utterly alone, cut off from the very winds she was born to interpret. Gazing out her narrow window at the city of Ethel, sprawling below, glittering under a sky that was beginning to bruise with the signs of a coming storm, she faced the most desolate decision of her life. The institutional path was closed to her. The Conclave, the very body meant to heed the storm's warnings, had chosen willful blindness. In that profound silence, a new resolve, as hard and sharp as the shard of void rock she still clutched, solidified within her. If the guardians of the city would not listen, then she would take her warning directly to the city itself. It was a decision that meant burning every bridge behind her. To escape the Spire against the Conclave's decree was to renounce her identity as a storm speaker. She would become an outlaw, a fugitive from the only law she had ever respected. But the alternative, sitting in this room while the city marched toward oblivion, was a betrayal of everything the storm speakers were supposed to stand for. The personal stakes were no longer about her position or reputation. They were about her very liberty, and she was willing to trade that liberty for one last, desperate chance to be heard. The storm gathering outside her window, with its flashes of lightning and low growls of thunder, was no longer just a weather pattern. It was a reflection of the tempest of rebellion and sacrifice now raging within her soul. The storm that broke over the obsidian spire was not an act of nature. It was an answer to the tempest raging within Lyra's own heart. As the first peal of thunder shook the mountain, a profound and terrifying clarity settled over her. The lock on her door was a mere formality. Her true prison was the silence and inaction of the Conclave. The howling wind and driving rain, which would keep any sensible person indoors, were now her greatest allies. She stood at her narrow window, feeling the spray of rain on her face, and made a final, irrevocable choice. She would not wait for a judgment that would never come. She would escape or die trying. Her plan relied on a finesse with her gift that she had never before attempted. It was one thing to call a gust of wind or summon a mist. It was another to weave the storm itself into a tool for stealth. As she pried open the window's latch, the wind screamed as if in protest. She did not fight it. Instead, she extended her will, not to calm the gale, but to guide it. She focused on the sound of her movements, the scrape of her boots on the sill, the rustle of her cloak. With a delicate, exhausting concentration, she wrapped the roaring wind around these tiny noises, allowing the storm to absorb them completely. To any listener, even one in the hallway outside her door, her escape would be masked by the cacophony of the elements, a perfect auditory disguise. The outer wall of the spire was a sheer, rain-slicked cliff face, a descent that would have been suicidal in calm weather. Now, in the blinding storm, it was a descent into madness. There were no ropes, no harnesses, only the ancient, uneven grooves in the stone, worn by centuries of wind and water. Her fingers, numb with cold, found each tiny ledge by feel alone. Her progress was a desperate, inch-by-inch dance with gravity. At one heart-stopping moment, her foot slipped on the wet rock, and she swung out into the void, her body slamming against the stone. Only a reflexive, panicked push of air from her hands, a cushion that stole the breath from her lungs, prevented a fatal fall. She hung there, suspended by a thread of power and will, the city lights far below swirling in the rain like drowned stars. This was the external conflict in its purest form, a brutal struggle against the indifferent fury of the storm, a fight for every inch of freedom. When her feet finally touched the sodden earth at the base of the spire, the relief was so immense her knees buckled. But there was no time for respite. She was outside the walls, but she was far from safe. The storm might have hidden her escape, but it also turned the familiar streets of Ethel into a hostile, flooded landscape. The conflict shifted instantly from a vertical climb to a horizontal flight. Every shadowed alleyway could conceal a city watchman, or worse, a guild enforcer. The warm, glowing windows of homes and taverns were no longer beacons of comfort. They were eyes that might see her, mouths that might report her. She was an intruder in her own city, a ghost haunting the place she was trying to save. The crushing weight of her loneliness descended upon her then, a cold deeper than the rain. She had severed herself from the only community she had ever known. There would be no warm meal in the refectory, no quiet conversation in the archives, no guiding, if frustrating, presence like Ronan's. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. By the time a grim, gray dawn began to bleed through the clouds, Lyra was a different person. The neat, disciplined acolyte was gone, replaced by a drenched, shivering fugitive, huddled in the leaky doorway of an abandoned tannery, the stench of old chemicals clinging to her clothes. The first light revealed posters already being nailed to public boards by official town criers. The face staring back from the crude wood cut print was her own, though the artist had captured none of her youth, only a wildness in the eyes. The words beneath it branded her a rogue element, a dangerous apostate who had violated the sacred laws of the Storm Speakers and was to be apprehended on sight for questioning. The Conclave had moved with a swift, cruel efficiency she had not anticipated. Her identity, her very name, was now a crime. This left her with a single, stark path forward. She could not survive on the streets for long, and she certainly could not challenge the guild as a solitary, hunted figure. She needed allies, but not from the powerful or the respectable. They were all part of the system that had condemned her. Her only hope lay with the others who had been pushed to the margins by that same system. The people who had lost their homes to the guild's expansion, the laborers cheated of their wages, the families whose water had been poisoned by the runoff from the new construction. These were the people who had nothing left to lose, the ones who had already been wronged. Her journey was no longer an investigation. It was a recruitment drive for a rebellion that did not yet exist. She had to find the invisible citizens of Ethel, the ones who lived in its cracks and shadows, and convince them that her impossible warning was their only hope. The stakes had escalated beyond anything she could have imagined just hours before. It was no longer about proving a point or saving her standing. It was a matter of life and death, and not just for the city, but for her personally. The authorities of both the Spire and the Guild would show her no mercy if she were caught. The familiar city streets, which she had once walked with the confident air of a scholar in training, were now a labyrinth where every corner could lead to a capture. Every face could be that of an enemy. Her simple quest for truth had transformed into a desperate act of rebellion, and she was now its first and only soldier, stepping out of the doorway and into the damp, dangerous dawn to find an army among the forgotten. Exhaustion was a leaden cloak, dragging Lyra deeper into the city's forgotten corners. For 2 days, she had moved like a phantom through the damp, narrow alleys behind the main thoroughfares, surviving on stolen crusts of bread and the increasingly bitter taste of her own fear. The official posters bearing her face were everywhere, and every pair of eyes that glanced her way felt like a potential threat. It was in this state of near despair, hiding in the reeking shadows of an outflow pipe that dribbled filth into the river Etha, that her flight came to an abrupt end. A hand, surprisingly strong, clamped over her mouth from behind, and another pinned her arms. She was dragged, struggling weakly, not into the open street, but down a crumbling set of stone steps, hidden behind a waterfall of thick ivy, and into the absolute darkness of the undercroft. When the blindfold was removed, she found herself not in a dank prison, but in a cavernous space that defied all her expectations. Flickering torchlight reflected off slow-moving, dark water that flowed through a channel carved down the center of a wide tunnel. The air was heavy with the smell of damp stone, moss, and wood smoke, but it was not the oppressive stench of the sewers above. It was the smell of a place that had been lived in for a very long time. Makeshift dwellings, built from salvaged timber and scraps of sailcloth, lined the higher, dry ledges of the tunnel. Faces, weary and etched with the hardships of a life, lived in perpetual twilight, peered out at her from the shadows. She was surrounded. At the center of the group stood a woman who commanded attention without saying a word. She had the lean, muscular build of someone who fought currents for a living, and her eyes held a sharp, assessing intelligence. This was Anya. Lyra expected accusations, or at best, the cold calculation of captors deciding her fate. Instead, Anya's gaze fell upon the Storm Speaker amulet that had slipped from Lyra's tunic during the struggle. A complex emotion flickered across the Riverfolk leader's face, not reverence, but a spark of grim recognition. "We do not often have guests from the spire," Anya said, her voice echoing softly in the cavern. "Especially ones with such expensive faces plastered all over the city. The guild wants you badly. That in itself is a recommendation down here." She did not offer kindness, but a stark proposition born of shared enmity. She spoke of old grudges, of fishing grounds poisoned by runoff from guild factories, of families displaced from the riverbanks to make way for their warehouses. The merchant guild was a common enemy and a hunted storm soaker. Even a young, disheveled one represented a potential weapon they had not possessed before. The consequences of this capture were immediate and profound. Lyra was not thrown into a cell, but given a dry spot to sleep and a bowl of thin but hot fish stew. She had found a temporary sanctuary, a place where the city guard dared not venture. More importantly, she had stumbled upon a network of eyes and ears that saw Ethel from a perspective she had never considered, from below. These were the people who navigated the secret waterways, who heard the echoes of conversations from the streets above through grates, who noticed the subtle changes everyone else missed. And the most significant change they reported, one that made Lyra's blood run cold, was the declining health of the river itself. They spoke of fish with strange lesions, of a metallic tang in the water that had grown stronger since the bridge's construction, of a sluggishness in the current that felt unnatural. Their observations were not born from prophecy, but from an intimate, daily dependence on the river's flow, and they corroborated her vision of a tainted lifeblood with a grim, earthly finality. Yet, this alliance was a fragile thing, a pact built on the shifting sands of mutual need rather than the bedrock of trust. Lyra was an outsider, a figure from the lofty spire that had always ignored the plight of those in the undercroft. She had to navigate the delicate politics of a community that had been oppressed for so long that suspicion was their first language. To them, she was a tool, and tools could be discarded. She needed to prove her value was greater than just being a symbol of the guild's displeasure. She started by offering small things, using her understanding of air currents to help ventilate their deeper living chambers, reading the weather patterns for their fishermen who dared to venture out onto the open river at night. Each small act was a brick laid in the foundation of a very cautious respect. The tension was a constant, humming presence. Could she trust Anya not to sell her out for a guild pardon? Could the river folk trust that this stranger's cause was truly their own? The decision Lyra faced was a monumental gamble. Holding on to her secrets had been her only protection for so long. But to transform this alliance of convenience into a true partnership, she had to offer something real, something that would demonstrate a faith she was not even sure she felt. One evening, as they sat by the torchlit canal, the sounds of the hidden community, a soft murmur around them, Lyra made her choice. She looked at Anya and began to speak, not as a strategist, but as the terrified acolyte on the spire. She shared the full, unvarnished truth of her prophecy, the cracking towers, the river of blood, the devouring shadow. She held nothing back, laying her deepest fear and her greatest vulnerability bare before this pragmatic leader. In doing so, the stakes of her entire mission were irrevocably transformed. It was no longer just about saving the physical structures of Ethel or proving the Conclave wrong. It became a fight for the people the city had forgotten, the ones who lived in its veins and would be the first to drown in its collapse. This was about justice. Anya listened in silence, her face unreadable until Lyra finished. Then she simply nodded, a slow, decisive gesture. "The river has been screaming for a long time," she said. "We just didn't know how to translate its words." In that moment, the solitary crusade gained a heartbeat. A movement was born, not in the halls of power, but in the stagnant, listening waters of the forgotten canals, where new plans began to take root in the dark. The relative safety of the Undercroft was shattered in an instant, not by the sound of guards or the threat of discovery, but by the world itself groaning in protest. It began as a low, deep rumble that seemed to rise up through the very stone beneath their feet, a vibration that was felt more than heard. Then the tremor hit, a violent, jerking shudder that sent pots clattering from ledges and sent shockwaves through the dark water of the canals. Dust and small stones rained from the ceiling of the cavern, and for a terrifying few seconds, the entire hidden community held its breath, fearing their underground sanctuary would become their tomb. As the shaking subsided, a new sound reached them from the world above, not the orderly alarm of bells, but the chaotic, rising crescendo of screams. Lyra, Anya, and a handful of the river folk scrambled up a narrow access tunnel, emerging into a scene of utter chaos. The air, usually thick with the smells of the market, was now choked with dust. Their destination was clear. A crowd was already gathering along the riverbank near the Great Bridge, their faces etched with a primal fear. Pushing through the throng, they saw it. A sizable section of the riverbank had simply given way, collapsing into the churning water in a mess of mud, shattered paving stones, and the exposed roots of now tilted trees. The gaping wound in the earth was directly adjacent to one of the bridge's massive support pylons, which now stood exposed, its foundation looking dangerously undercut. This was no minor subsidence. It was a direct tear in the city's fabric, a physical confirmation of the instability Lyra had only sensed and prophesied. While the crowd panicked, pointing and shouting, Lyra's focus turned inward. Closing her eyes against the distraction, she reached out with her spirit, extending her senses down into the violated ground. Where she expected to feel the solid, reassuring presence of packed earth and stone, she instead encountered a chilling void. It was a profound emptiness, a pocket of unnatural instability that seemed to suck at her awareness. And at its heart, she could feel the familiar, soul-numbing cold of the void rock, not as a static object, but as an active cancer, radiating a dissonant energy that was actively weakening the surrounding material. The ground wasn't just wet or loose, it was being unmade from within, its fundamental integrity dissolved by the corrosive presence the guild had buried there. The physical conflict was no longer a future possibility. It was a present, immediate, and terrifyingly tangible reality. The consequences of this event unfolded with a brutal swiftness that mirrored the collapse itself. The public panic was palpable, a raw, infectious fear that spread through the city faster than any rumor. For the first time, ordinary citizens who had dismissed the talk of a rogue storm speaker were now confronted with undeniable proof that something was deeply wrong. Lyra's warnings, once the ravings of an outcast, now carried the chilling weight of credibility. But the Merchant Guild was not idle. Almost before the dust had settled, their representatives were in the streets, their voices calm and authoritative amidst the hysteria. They blamed the collapse on a known pocket of unstable alluvial soil, a simple geological anomaly. They spoke of the city's resilience, of their unwavering commitment to its safety, and promised immediate, extensive repairs. It was a masterclass in propaganda, using the crisis not as a moment of reckoning, but as an opportunity to present themselves as the city's steadfast protectors, thereby consolidating their power and control over the narrative and the populace's fragile trust. Watching the guild's smooth-tongued spokesman work the crowd, Lyra understood the futility of her previous approach, presenting evidence, arguing in secret chambers, even escaping to warn the people. It was all being swept aside by a well-funded, highly organized machine of lies. The tremor had made the danger real, but the guild was ensuring that their version of reality was the one people accepted. The race was no longer a slow investigation. It was a desperate sprint against time before a far more catastrophic collapse occurred, one that would swallow not just a section of Riverbank, but entire city blocks and thousands of lives. The stakes had escalated from saving a civilization to preventing a massacre that could happen at any moment. Turning to Anya, her face grim with the same realization, Lyra voiced the decision that felt both insane and utterly necessary. We cannot fight them with words or hidden proof anymore, she said, her voice barely a whisper over the din of the crowd. They control the language of this city. We need to speak in a tongue that cannot be twisted or ignored. We need a sign, a spectacle so vast and undeniable that it will cut through their lies and speak directly to every soul in Ethel. She was proposing a move from the shadows into the blinding light, to use the very power the guild sought to discredit, the power of the storm and the sky, to deliver a message that no official proclamation could ever erase. It was a call to create a miracle or a disaster in full view of the city they were trying to save, a final, desperate gamble to make the invisible corruption visible to all. The groaning earth had issued its warning. Now they had to answer it with a voice that would shake the heavens. Back in the dim, torch-lit quiet of the Undercroft, the frantic energy of the Riverbank Collapse slowly solidified into a cold, hard resolve. The guild's swift lies had proven one thing conclusively. The truth, whispered in secret or shouted in panic, was not enough. It needed a language that could not be edited, a canvas too vast for their propaganda to cover. Lyra found her answer not in the earth, but in the heavens. She remembered an old scroll from the archives, a fragment describing a celestial event that would grace the skies in just a few nights' time, the tears of the sky dragon, an annual meteor shower. Most saw it as a simple spectacle, a night for wishes. Lyra saw it as a palette of light, waiting to be shaped. Her plan was as audacious as it was simple, a fusion of raw power and delicate artistry that made even the hardened river folk fall silent when she explained it. She would not just watch the meteors, she would command them. Using her gift as a storm speaker, she would reach up into the very fabric of the night sky, amplify the burning trails of the shooting stars, and weave them together. She would paint her prophecy across the darkness for every man, woman, and child in Ethel to see. The jagged crack splitting the heavens, the coiled serpent of pride devouring itself. It was a plan to turn the sky into a storybook, to make the invisible corruption terrifyingly visible, speaking directly to the hearts of the people, over the heads of their deceitful leaders and their hesitant guardians. But the cost of such a miracle was as staggering as its ambition. The archives had spoken of similar attempts in ages past, always with a grim footnote. Channeling energy on such a scale was not like summoning a gust of wind. It was an act of spiritual transfusion, requiring the caster to pour their own life force into the heavens to guide the light. The scrolls used terms like soul burn and spirit drain. Lyra knew this was not a mere risk of exhaustion. It was a very real chance that the ritual would consume her completely, leaving her an empty shell on a rooftop while her warning blazed overhead. The choice was brutal: risk a silent death to give the city a voice, or stay safe and condemn everyone to a doom they refused to see. The danger was not confined to the metaphysical. The moment she began channeling such immense power, she would become a beacon to anyone with even a flicker of sensitivity to the storm's energy. The guild's mysterious allies, the ones Ronan had warned her about, would sense her immediately. She would be a stationary target, utterly vulnerable, her consciousness stretched across the sky, while her body remained defenseless below. This is where Anya and her people stepped in, their roles shifting from informants to guardians. They agreed to create a web of diversions throughout the city, starting small fires in empty guild warehouses, causing disturbances at guard posts, anything to draw attention away from the central districts and create a buffer of chaos around Lyra's position. Theirs was a mission of misdirection, a desperate attempt to hide a signal flare by setting the whole city smoldering. As the night of the shower approached, Lyra felt a profound shift within herself. This decision to proceed was more than just a tactical choice. It was the final, irrevocable step in her transformation. By undertaking this unsanctioned, immensely powerful ritual, she was no longer an acolyte of the Order, or even a rogue storm speaker. She was claiming the full mantle of what a storm speaker was always meant to be, a guardian who acted, not when permitted, but when necessary. She was accepting a role defined not by the approval of elders, but by the desperate needs of the people. This acceptance came with a strange peace, a calming of the internal storm that had raged within her since her first vision. The doubt was gone, replaced by a terrifying clarity of purpose. The stakes of this single night could not be higher, and they were layered like the city itself. On the most immediate level, it was Lyra's life energy against the soul of Ethel. If she failed, if her strength gave out or the guild's allies found her, she would die, and the city would lose its last, best warning. But success promised something far greater than mere survival. A symbol seen by thousands, burned into the collective memory of the populace, could not be unseen. It could shatter the guild's narrative in an instant, transforming public fear into public fury. It could be the spark that would ignite a revolution, turning the people from passive victims into active defenders of their own future. As the sun dipped below the horizon on the appointed day, the sky began to deepen from blue to a velvety indigo. The air itself grew still, as if the world were holding its breath, waiting to see if one young woman's courage could bend the heavens to her will and remind a civilization of its own fragility. The appointed night arrived with a sky of perfect, crystal clarity, a deep velvet blackness pricked by the cold, distant light of a million stars. Lyra stood on a secluded rooftop, a forgotten terrace high above the winding streets of Ethel, her chosen platform for a performance that would decide the city's fate. The air was still and cold, carrying the distant, festive sounds of a city, oblivious to the sword hanging over its head. Then, the first meteor streaked across the darkness, a silent, silver scratch on the face of the night. It was the signal. As more followed, painting fleeting lines of fire, Lyra closed her eyes, planted her feet firmly on the rough tiles, and raised her arms to the heavens. This was not a summoning of a storm, but an invitation, an opening of her entire being to the vast energies flowing above. The power did not crash into her like a wave. It flooded her like a rising tide. She could feel the electric potential of the upper atmosphere, the raw, untamed life of the storm that was always present, even on a clear night, and she could feel the celestial fire of the meteors, the burning trails of cosmic dust. Her mind became a loom, and these energies were her threads. With an act of will that was both immense concentration and total surrender, she began to weave. She caught the streaks of light and stretched them, bending their paths, intensifying their glow. Against the backdrop of the night, a colossal, jagged crack began to form, as if the sky itself were a pane of glass splintering under an unbearable weight. It hung there, brilliant and terrifying, a silent scream of warning visible from every corner of the city. Below, the festive atmosphere curdled into confusion, then swelled into a roaring uproar. The music and laughter from the city squares died away, replaced by a wave of gasps, shouts, and cries of alarm. People poured from their homes and taverns, their faces turned upward, illuminated by the impossible spectacle. They did not need an elder to interpret this. The message was primal, immediate. The symbol of the cracking tower was one they saw every day in their own skyline. The fear was no longer an abstract concept discussed in whispers. It was a light show from the gods, a confirmation of their deepest, unspoken anxieties. The common people, the merchants, the laborers, they understood, but the merchant guild's response was as swift as it was predictable. From the balconies of their fortified compounds, their spokesmen could be heard shouting over the growing panic, their voices amplified by metal cones. "A trick," they cried, "a clever illusion of light, a desperate ploy by the rogue elements who seek to destabilize our great city. Do not be fooled by this deceit." Even as they spoke, squads of guild guards, distinct from the city watch in their dark, unmarked armor, began to move through the streets. Their orders were clear: find the source of this trickery and extinguish it. The hunt was on, and Lyra, a beacon of power shining in the darkness, was their primary target. The conflict became a terrifying split in her consciousness. The greater part of her mind was stretched across the sky, a gossamer thin net of will holding the brilliant, terrifying symbols in place. It was an agony of focus, like trying to hold back the ocean with her bare hands. Every second drained her, pulling at the very core of her life force. Yet, a sliver of her awareness remained tethered to her body on the rooftop, and through that connection, she heard the sounds of the battle raging in the streets below. Anya and her river folk were keeping their promise. The clash of steel, shouted orders, and the roar of small, diversionary fires created a chaotic symphony beneath the silent drama in the heavens. Each cry of pain from below was a lash against her concentration, a reminder that people were risking their lives for every second she maintained the display. Pushed to the absolute precipice of her endurance, her body trembling and her vision blurring at the edges, Lyra faced a final, critical choice. The symbols of doom were etched brilliantly in the sky, a perfect representation of her prophecy. She could let the energy go now, retreat into the darkness, and hope the message had been seared into the city's memory. But as she felt the hope and terror of thousands of upturned faces, a new understanding dawned. A warning of pure despair might only lead to fatalism or riot. What the people needed, what she herself needed to believe, was not just a prediction of the end, but a reason to fight against it. With the last dregs of her strength, she made her decision. She would not end on a note of annihilation. Gathering the final fragments of her power, she reached for one last, fading meteor. Instead of weaving it into the tapestry of doom, she focused it, purified its light into a single, piercing point of pure, unwavering silver. She placed this lone, hopeful star at the very center of the cracking sky, a defiant symbol that the future was not yet written, that a choice remained. It was a message of courage to counter the fear. The effort was the final straw. As the star blazed into existence, the intricate web of energy she had woven snapped. The great symbols in the sky dissolved into a shower of harmless, fading sparks. Lyra's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the cold rooftop, completely spent, teetering on the edge of unconsciousness. The display was over, but the seed of doubt, now mixed with a fragile ember of hope, had been sown deep in the heart of every citizen who had witnessed the night of omens. The spiritual battle for the city's soul and the political battle for its future had irrevocably merged, and the conflict was now out in the open for all to see. The celestial spectacle above Ethel did not fade from the sky so much as it burned itself into the memory of the city, and its aftershocks rippled through the halls of the obsidian spire with the force of a physical quake. The conclave could no longer hide behind debates and deliberations. The heavens themselves had spoken in a language every citizen could understand, and the silence of the storm speakers was becoming a deafening condemnation. The following morning, as the city buzzed with a volatile mixture of terror and hope, Elder Myron made her move. She did not request an audience. She summoned one. Standing in the same circular chamber where Lyra had been condemned, Myron faced the gathered elders, but her words were not for them alone. The great doors had been left open, and a crowd of acolytes and junior speakers filled the antechamber, their faces a mirror of the city's turmoil. Her voice, usually so measured and calm, rang out with a clarion certainty that brooked no argument. We have witnessed a sign that cannot be explained away as illusion or hysteria, she declared, her gaze sweeping across the stunned conclave before settling squarely on Kalin. While we have cloistered ourselves in debate, a young woman we cast out has done the duty we abandoned. She has spoken the storm's truth to the people, and in doing so, she has reminded us of our covenant, not with the city's rulers, but with its soul. Then came the words that would forever fracture the ancient order. I will no longer be party to this silence. I stand with Lyra. I choose warning over comfort and action over stability. The gasp that went through the chamber was not just one of surprise, but of historic rupture, and as the shockwave settled, another figure stepped from the shadows to stand beside Myron. It was Ronan. He said nothing, his presence alone a thunderous declaration. His weary eyes, which had seen so much failure, now held a resolute fire that seemed to scorch the very stone. The disillusioned mentor had chosen a side, and his allegiance lent a weight of tragic experience to the reformers' cause. The consequences were immediate and irreversible. The Storm Speakers, an order that had stood united for centuries, splintered before the sun reached its zenith. The division was not neat, but it was stark. Arrayed behind Kalin were the traditionalists, the elders who believed their primary role was to advise the city's power structure, to maintain order, and to interpret the storms within the safe confines of tradition. To them, Lyra was a dangerous radical, and her public display was an act of sedition that threatened to plunge Ethel into chaos. Theirs was a philosophy of control. Facing them were the reformers, a faction led by Myron and swelled by the younger acolytes, whose hearts had been set ablaze by the Night of Omens. They argued that the Storm Speakers were not mere advisors to power, but guardians of the people, and that their first duty was to the truth, no matter how disruptive. Lyra, though absent, became the symbolic heart of this rebellion, a living testament to the cost of courage. This internal civil war transformed the conflict entirely. The external struggle against the Merchant Guild was now matched by a bitter, deeply personal battle for the soul of the order itself. The hallowed halls of the Spire, once a place of quiet study and unified purpose, became an armed camp of simmering tension. Acolytes who had trained together for years now avoided each other's gaze. Debates over prophecy turned into shouted arguments about loyalty and treason. The very architecture of the place reflected the schism, with traditionalists controlling the upper libraries and ceremonial halls, while the reformers consolidated their strength in the lower levels and the archives of echoes, which they now saw not as a tomb of past failures, but as an arsenal of lessons for the fight ahead. For Lyra, receiving the news in the dank safety of the Undercroft was a surreal and overwhelming experience. The fugitive, hunted by the very people she had called family, was now the figurehead of a movement within that family. The weight of this new role settled on her shoulders, a mantle she had never sought and felt ill-prepared to wear. Her first instinct had always been to act alone, to follow the truth wherever it led without regard for followers. Now she found herself in a makeshift war council with Anya, the pragmatic leader of the river folk, Elder Myron, a respected authority who had risked everything to join her, and Ronan, her once reluctant mentor, whose guilt had been forged into a weapon of resolve. She had to learn, and quickly, that leadership was not about solitary conviction, but about synthesis, merging Myron's strategic mind, Ronan's hard-won knowledge, and Anya's ground-level network into a single, cohesive force. The stakes of their struggle had escalated to a metaphysical level. This was no longer just about preventing the physical collapse of a city. It was a battle over the very purpose of foresight itself. Was the gift of the Storm Speakers meant to be a tool for maintaining the existing order, or a sacred charge to challenge that order when it strayed toward self-destruction? The outcome of this ideological war would define the order for generations to come. The obsidian spire, that needle of black stone piercing the clouds, was no longer a unified symbol of wisdom. It had become a divided monument, its shadow falling on a city torn between the fear of change and the hope of salvation, its peak a battleground for the future of prophecy itself. The fragile sanctuary of the Undercroft, a haven built on shared hardship and newfound trust, was shattered with a brutality that was both swift and absolute. The Guild's retaliation was not a subtle political maneuver or a whispered threat. It was a hammer blow designed to crush the rebellion in its cradle. Using their immense influence over the city's ruling council, they branded the river folk not as displaced citizens, but as a criminal syndicate, a nest of saboteurs harboring the dangerous fugitive Lyra. This legal fiction gave them the pretext they needed. At the darkest hour of the night, when the world above was silent, the peace of the caverns was broken not by the gentle lapping of water, but by the harsh, metallic clatter of armored boots on stone. City guards, their official insignia, a thin veneer over guild commands, poured into the Undercroft from multiple entrances, their torches casting jagged, menacing shadows on the damp walls. They moved with a purpose that spoke of detailed intelligence, bypassing empty tunnels and heading directly for the heart of the community. The resistance was brave, but hopelessly outmatched. Anya and her people fought with the ferocity of those defending their only home, using their knowledge of the twisting waterways and narrow ledges to their advantage. They were fishermen and scavengers, not soldiers, and their tools were fishing spears and clubs against sharpened steel and reinforced shields. Lyra, awakened by the shouts and the clash of metal, rushed into the chaos, her heart a frantic drum in her chest. She tried to use her gift to summon a concealing mist or a disruptive gust, but the confined, panicked space made such delicate work impossible. A reckless blast of wind might collapse a tunnel or send her own allies tumbling into the dark water. She was helpless, forced to watch as the guards, with cold efficiency, surrounded Anya. The river folk leader fought like a demon, but she was overwhelmed, disarmed, and dragged away in chains, along with a dozen of her most loyal followers. As quickly as they had come, the guards retreated, leaving the remaining river folk in a stunned, grieving silence, their sanctuary violated, their leader stolen. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Lyra's alliance, a fragile network of trust that had taken so much courage to build, was crippled in a single, ruthless stroke. The Undercroft was no longer a safe haven. It was a known location, a crime scene. The river folk who remained looked upon Lyra with a new, complex emotion. It wasn't blame, not exactly, but a raw, aching loss that was now inextricably tied to her presence. She had brought the storm to their doorstep. The guilt that washed over Lyra was a physical sickness, a cold weight in her stomach that threatened to pull her under. These people had offered her shelter, had believed in her cause, and now their homes were invaded and their friends were captives because of her. Anya, who had shown her such pragmatic faith, was gone. The external conflict with the guild had suddenly become terrifyingly personal. It was no longer an abstract battle for a city's soul, but a direct, brutal confrontation that had taken a friend. This forced upon Lyra a moral conflict that tore at her very being. The tactically sound decision, the choice a cold military strategist would make, was clear. She had to retreat. She had to disappear into the city's other shadows, regroup with Myron and Ronan, and continue the fight from a position of strength. A rescue mission was precisely what the guild wanted. It was an obvious, blatant trap. Walking into it would be an act of suicide that would spell the end of their entire movement. Yet, as she looked at the faces of the river folk, the children crying for their captured parents, the old men staring with hollow eyes, the calculus of war felt like a monstrous betrayal. How could she ask these people to follow her if she was willing to sacrifice their leader for a strategic advantage? How could she call herself a guardian of the people if she abandoned the first person who had offered her true sanctuary when she had nothing? To leave Anya to the guild's mercy was to become as calculating and heartless as the enemy they fought. The decision, when it came, was not born of a fiery, impulsive heroism, but from a deep, sorrowful resolve. She knew it was a trap. She knew the odds were impossible, but she also knew that some lines could not be crossed, some debts could not be ignored. To abandon a friend was a price her spirit could not pay, even if it cost her the war. She would not become a symbol who sacrificed others for the greater good. She would be a person who stood by her friends. Gathering the few rebel storm speakers who had escaped the spire with Myron, she laid out her plan. It was not a strategy for victory, but a desperate blueprint for a rescue. They would assault the old mill on the river's edge, the place where Finn's information suggested the prisoners were being held. It was a terrible plan, and everyone in the dimly lit cavern knew it. The stakes of the entire conflict were transformed in that moment. They were no longer about prophecies or political ideologies. They were now about the life of one brave woman. The guild, by targeting Lyra's allies instead of Lyra herself, had revealed a new level of cunning and cruelty. They were not just corrupt, they were sadistic, willing to use innocent lives as bait to snare their true target. This action showed a depth of moral bankruptcy that went beyond greed, exposing a villainy that enjoyed the game of cruelty. As Lyra prepared to lead her small, hopeless band toward the mill, the weight of her choice was a heavy cloak upon her shoulders. She was walking into the lion's den with open eyes, trading the fate of a city for the soul of a friendship, a gamble where the only certain outcome was that the night would end in blood, and the course of the rebellion would be decided not by a grand battle, but by a desperate act of loyalty. The assault on the old mill began not with a shout, but with the sudden, unnatural roar of a concentrated gale. Lyra and her small band of rebel storm speakers, their faces set in masks of grim determination, used the storm's fury as their vanguard. A whirlwind of leaves, dust, and splintered wood slammed into the mill's main doors, tearing them from their hinges and creating a chaotic entrance. For a few fleeting moments, their strategy of overwhelming force seemed to work. Lightning called down from the clear night sky with a crack that deafened the senses, struck the mill's tall chimney, sending a shower of bricks cascading onto the roof and adding to the confusion. They surged inside, their hearts pounding with the desperate hope of a swift, clean rescue. But the interior of the mill was a death trap, laid with cold precision. The moment they crossed the threshold, the illusion of surprise evaporated. Instead of a handful of guards watching over a single prisoner, they found themselves facing a veritable army of guild mercenaries. These were not the lazy city watchmen. They were hardened fighters, clad in reinforced leather and chainmail, their faces impassive. They emerged from the shadows of the giant, silent grinding stones, from the upper loft, from behind sacks of grain, their swords already drawn. The rebels' whirlwind assault, which had felt so powerful outside, was suddenly contained and dissipated within the vast, open space of the milling floor. They were not out maneuvering an enemy, they were being swallowed by one. The fight that followed was a brutal, close-quarters slaughter. The Storm Speaker's gifts, so potent in the open sky, were dangerously constrained. A blast of wind could as easily knock a comrade off a catwalk as it could an enemy. Ronan, fighting with the desperate strength of a man absolving a lifetime of guilt, positioned himself as a shield for Lyra, using controlled bursts of air to deflect arrows and parry sword strikes. He was a formidable warrior, his movements economical and deadly, but he was one man against a tide. As Lyra tried to create a diversion by summoning a thick, blinding mist, a crossbow bolt, fired from the darkness of the loft, found its mark. It was not a clean shot, but a ragged, tearing impact in Ronan's shoulder that spun him around with a grunt of pain and shock. Lyra saw him fall, his face pale, his own storm energy flickering and dying as his concentration shattered. The sight was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. The mentor who had armed her, who had finally chosen to fight, was down, and it was because of her. With Ronan wounded, the last vestiges of their resistance crumbled. They were disarmed, beaten back into a tight circle, and surrounded by a ring of mercenary steel. The clatter of their few weapons hitting the wooden floor was the sound of absolute defeat. Rough hands bound their wrists with coarse rope, and they were shoved into a cold, stone-lined storage cellar, the heavy door slamming shut and plunging them into near total darkness. The only light came from a small, barred window high on the wall, casting a sliver of pale moonlight onto the filthy straw covering the floor. The consequences of their failed mission were absolute. They were all captives, their rebellion seemingly snuffed out in a single, disastrous night. Anya, whom they had come to save, was likely in another cell, her fate now tied even more tightly to their own. The despair in that cellar was a tangible presence, thick and suffocating, broken only by the ragged sound of Ronan's breathing as one of the other rebels tried to staunch the flow of blood from his wound. In the crushing silence that followed, Lyra faced the full weight of her choices. She had led her friends, the only people who still believed in her, into a trap she knew was waiting. Her desire to save one friend had doomed them all. The physical conflict was over, and they had lost. The tension now was internal, a silent scream of guilt and failure that echoed louder than any clap of thunder. She looked at the faces of her companions in the dim light, the young acolytes who had followed her out of the spire, their idealism now replaced by fear, the stoic river folk who had trusted her, Ronan, who had paid for his loyalty in blood. This was the price of her defiance, and it was a cost borne by everyone but her. It was in this moment of utter hopelessness that a new resolve, as hard and cold as the stone floor beneath her, began to form. If this was the end, if they were to be executed at dawn as examples to the city, then she would not let her final act be one of silent submission. The guild relied on lies and fear to maintain control. They silenced dissent and buried the truth. Her prophecy, the vision that had started it all, was the one weapon they could not take from her, and so she made a decision. She would not whisper prayers or curses. She would speak the truth, leaning her head back against the damp wall, She began to recite the prophecy, her voice low but clear in the stillness of the cell. She did not shout or scream it like a madwoman. She spoke with the calm, measured cadence of a chronicler, as if she were back in the archives of echoes, reading from one of the ancient slates. She described the cracking towers, the river of blood, the devouring shadow, but she went further, weaving in the details she had discovered the void rock from the accursed peaks, the guild's ledgers, the symbol of the serpent hidden in the bridge's stonework. She spoke not to her captors outside the door, but to the very walls, ensuring her words would carry through the cracks and into the ears of the guards stationed in the mill. She was planting seeds, tiny, fragile seeds of doubt, in the minds of men who were perhaps just following orders, men who had families in the city she was describing in its death throes. At first, there was only silence from beyond the door. Then, a low murmur of conversation. A gruff voice told her to shut up, but the command lacked conviction. She continued, her voice gaining a fiery conviction that belied her chains. She spoke of Thalassar, of the pride that had sunk a kingdom beneath the waves, and she drew the direct, terrifying parallel to Ethel's own ambition. She spoke of the storm speakers who had been ignored, and the price those civilizations had paid. Her words were no longer just a prediction. They were a history lesson with a dire warning for the present. The cold, unforgiving floor of the mill cell was a stark contrast to the heat of her conviction, a fire that not even capture could extinguish. The stakes in that moment could not have been higher. It was the absolute lowest point, the apparent termination of their rebellion and the end of their lives. Yet, in this moment of utter defeat, Lyra's decision to use her voice instead of accepting silence created a subtle but crucial escalation. Her words did not break their chains, but they did something perhaps more important. They cracked the monolithic certainty of their captors. Some of the lower-ranking guards, the ones who lived in the city and not in the guild's gilded halls, shifted uneasily. The official story of a troublesome acolyte and a band of criminals began to fray at the edges when faced with such a calm, detailed, and terrifyingly plausible account of their city's doom. The rebellion was captured, but its message, carried on the unwavering voice of its leader, had just found a new, unwilling audience, and a single spark of doubt can sometimes be enough to ignite a change of heart. The darkness in the mill's cellar was not just an absence of light, it was a physical weight, heavy with the scent of old grain, blood, and defeat. Lyra's voice had finally grown hoarse, the last echoes of her prophecy fading against the cold stone walls. The only response from beyond the door had been a shifting silence, a quiet that felt more ominous than any threat. Hours bled together, marked only by Ronan's ragged breathing and the despair that settled over the small group like a shroud. This, then, was how it ended, not in a blaze of glory, but in the grim anonymity of a storage room, their warning dying with them. Lyra leaned her head back, closing her eyes against the hopelessness, preparing for the sound of footsteps that would lead to their execution. The sound that came was not the heavy tread of a mercenary. It was a faint, almost imperceptible scratching at the door's lock, a delicate series of clicks and scrapes that was utterly alien to the previous night's violence. The rebels tensed, a collective intake of breath held in the stale air. Then, with a soft, final click, the door swung inward just enough to admit a sliver of torchlight from the corridor and the silhouette of a single figure. It was one of the guards, the young man with the uneasy eyes who had been stationed outside their cell. He held a finger to his lips, his face pale and strained in the flickering light. In his other hand, he held not a weapon, but a heavy ring of keys. His movements were swift and silent. He did not speak as he moved from prisoner to prisoner, working at the knots on their bonds with practiced efficiency. When he reached Lyra, his eyes met hers for a brief, electric moment. In them, she saw not the cold obedience of a guild soldier, but a turmoil of fear and a desperate, newfound resolve. "Your words," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You spoke of the river turning. My sister lives near the bridge. I can't be a part of this anymore." His name, he said, was Finn. This confession, rushed and terrified, was all the explanation he could offer. He was betraying everything: his paymasters, his comrades, his own safety, for a sliver of doubt planted by a prisoner's final testament. Their escape was a ghostly procession through the sleeping mill. Finn led them, his knowledge of the guard rotations and back passages allowing them to slip past the few sentries still awake. They moved like whispers, their freedom feeling fragile and stolen, but the consequences of their failed raid were immediately apparent once they reached the cool night air outside. Ronan, leaning heavily on Lyra and another rebel, could barely stand. The crossbow wound in his shoulder was angry and inflamed, and the loss of blood had left him weak and feverish. Their flight from the mill was not a triumphant dash, but a slow, agonizing limp into the concealing shadows of the riverbank. They had escaped their chains, but they were far from safe. They were wounded, exhausted, and now carried the immense risk of a stranger whose motives were as fragile as his courage. This new reality introduced a conflict that was as much about trust as it was about survival. Every instinct born from weeks of being hunted screamed at Lyra to distrust Finn. What if this was an even more elaborate trap, a way for the guild to track them to their last remaining allies? What if his crisis of conscience was a ruse designed to make them lower their guard? The tension was a live wire in the air between them as they found temporary refuge in a hollowed-out boathouse, its rotten timbers offering meager protection from the elements and prying eyes. As the others settled Ronan onto a dry patch of ground, Lyra faced Finn. The young guard stood awkwardly, his guild-issue tunic a glaring symbol of the enemy they had just fled. He looked more like a scared boy than a sinister agent, but Lyra knew looks could be the most effective disguise of all. The decision she had to make was a monumental gamble, with all their lives as the wager. To send him away was to lose a potential source of crucial information, a window into the guild's plans that they desperately needed, but to keep him close was to invite a viper into their midst. Looking at Ronan's pale, unconscious form, Lyra knew their options had shrunk to almost nothing. They could not run, and they could not fight in their current state. They needed intelligence, and Finn was the only one who could provide it. Trust had to be a leap of faith, not a calculated certainty. She made her choice. In a low, firm voice, she gave Finn his first assignment. He was to slip back into the city before his absence was noted. He was to keep his ears open, to learn whatever he could about the guild's next move, their search patterns, their suspicions, their state of alert. It was a test as much as a task. If he returned, he would prove his loyalty. If he did not, they would know they had been played and would have to move immediately. As Finn nodded, his expression a mixture of terror and determination, and melted back into the night. The stakes of their struggle shifted in a subtle but profound way. The rebellion had survived its near annihilation by the thinnest of threads, but its nature had been fundamentally altered. It was no longer just a movement of storm speakers and the oppressed river folk. It now included a defector from the very heart of the enemy's apparatus. This changed the composition of their cause, introducing the possibility that the guild's power was not monolithic, that it was populated by ordinary people who could be swayed by conscience. It was a flicker of hope, but a dangerous one, for it relied entirely on the fragile conscience of a young man they had known for less than an hour. The darkness of the night, which had hidden their escape, now felt like a fragile shield, and the coming dawn would reveal whether their newfound ally was their salvation or their final undoing. The boathouse offered little more than a roof and the steady, rhythmic lapping of water against rotting pilings, but for the first time in days, it felt like a place of quiet revelation rather than a desperate hiding spot. Ronan's fever broke near dawn, his breathing easing from a ragged gasp to a deep, weary sigh. Lyra, who had not slept, watched as the color slowly returned to his face, the lines of pain softening into the more familiar grooves of a lifetime's burdens. When his eyes finally opened, they did not dart around in confusion or fear. Instead, they found hers, and in their depths was a clarity she had never seen before, a calm that seemed to have been forged in the fires of his suffering. The guarded, disillusioned mentor was gone. In his place was a man who had finally reached the end of his long, silent road. He did not speak of the pain in his shoulder or their narrow escape. His first words were for her. "You were right to speak in the cell," he said, his voice a dry whisper. "A truth unspoken is a weapon left in its sheath. I have carried a silent truth for most of my life." And then, in the gray, watery light of morning, with the sounds of the waking city, a distant murmur, Ronan told his story. It was not a tale from the archives. It was a confession from his own youth. Decades ago, as a promising young storm speaker, he had experienced a vision of terrifying clarity. It was not of Ethel, but of the sky realm of the Zephyrins, a civilization built upon floating mountains, masters of the air currents. He saw their great crystal spires, which drew power from the storms, shatter not from an external blow, but from a resonance within, a harmonic dissonance that turned their own source of power against them. He had taken his warning to the Zephyrin elders, just as Lyra had come before the Conclave, and just like her, he had been met with condescension and fear. They called his vision an imbalance, a sign of his own spiritual instability. They cautioned him against spreading panic, and I listened, Ronan said, the shame thick in his voice. I was so sure of my place within the order, so afraid of exile, that I allowed my certainty to be chipped away by their doubts. I told myself I was being prudent. I stayed silent. The consequence of that silence came a season later. A great storm, of a kind the Zephyrins had always harnessed, rolled across their floating peaks. But this time, the energy did not flow smoothly into their crystals. It reverberated, amplified by the very structures designed to contain it. The resulting cascade of power shattered the mountain foundations. The sky realm did not just fall, it was unmade, its people and their achievements scattered to the winds like dust. His subsequent disillusionment His withdrawal into the dusty silence of the archives was not born from a lack of belief in prophecy, but from an unbearable weight of guilt. He had not doubted the vision, he had doubted himself. He had chosen the safety of the institution over the safety of the people it was meant to serve, and an entire civilization had paid the price. I have lived every day since then in the shadow of that fall, he confessed, his gaze unwavering. I saw the same pattern beginning here in Ethel, and my first instinct was to stop you, to make you cautious, to force you into the same silence that had been my prison. I thought I was protecting you from my fate, but I was only protecting myself from having to face that failure again. This admission was the final brick removed from the wall between them. Lyra's understanding of their shared legacy shifted from an intellectual concept to a visceral, heartbreaking reality. She was not the first to walk this path. She was the next in a long, tragic line, and the man before her was a living monument to the cost of failure. The internal conflict that had defined Ronan for so long, the battle between his knowledge and his guilt, finally found its resolution in that damp boathouse. The wound he had suffered for her, the sight of her unwavering courage even in captivity, had broken the dam of his silence. By confessing, he was not seeking absolution. He was shedding a burden that had crippled him for a lifetime. The disillusioned scholar was gone, replaced by a warrior whose resolve was tempered in the fires of past regret. His weariness was no longer that of surrender, but of a soldier who has finally been given a chance to rejoin a battle he thought was lost forever. "You are stronger than I was, Lyra," he said, and the words were not a compliment, but a statement of fact. "You defied them from the start. You have a strength I lack. And that is why we might still have a chance." This newfound unity forged a bond that was deeper than mentor and student. It was the alliance of two souls who had seen the same terrible truth from different sides of history. The tension of mistrust was replaced by the solidity of a shared purpose. With Ronan's knowledge of past failures and Lyra's proven courage, their planning took on a new, decisive quality. They knew that petitions, spectacles, and even public sympathy were no longer enough. The guild's power was too entrenched, the conclave's inaction too predictable. The corruption was not just political, it was physical, a cancerous node of void rock pulsing at the heart of the Great Bridge. Lyra, drawing on her latest visions, revealed the final, critical piece of information. A celestial alignment was due in 3 days' time, a convergence of planetary forces that would act as a trigger, amplifying the dissonant energy of the void rock to a critical point. This was the point of no return. She had foreseen the moment the shadow would truly swallow the sun. Their decision, then, was the only one left that made any sense. It was a desperate, terrifying, and almost certainly suicidal plan. They would launch a direct assault on the bridge itself, not to destroy it, which would cause a catastrophic collapse and kill thousands, but to infiltrate its central pylon and disrupt the void rock's energy at its source. They would need to get past the guild's heightened security, navigate the treacherous foundations, and then attempt something that had never been done, not just to negate the corrupting energy, but to somehow purify it, to turn the instrument of doom back into a stable foundation. It was a task for which there was no precedent, only a theory born of Lyra's unique connection to the storm and Ronan's deep understanding of why past attempts had failed. The stakes of their mission expanded to encompass everything they were and everything that had come before, The personal stakes were absolute. Their lives, and the lives of their few remaining allies, would be wagered on this single throw of the dice. But the cosmic stakes were even greater. This was no longer just about saving Ethel. It was about breaking the historical cycle that Ronan's story exemplified, the endless, tragic pattern of a civilization being warned and refusing to listen until it was too late. Success would mean more than the survival of a city. It would mean that the legacy of the Storm Speakers could be rewritten from one of tragic foresight to one of active salvation. Their plan was a gamble with the highest possible price, a final, defiant stand at the very heart of the gathering storm, where the fate of a city and the meaning of its prophets would be decided together. The city of Ethel had never seemed more vibrant or more alien. The grand festival of the founding was in full swing, a celebration of the city's prosperity that painted every street in garish, cheerful colors. Banners fluttered in a breeze that smelled of roasting meat and spiced wine, and the air thrummed with the discordant melodies of a dozen different minstrel bands. For Lyra and her small, desperate band, this carnival atmosphere was not a backdrop for joy, but the perfect cloak for their mission. Thanks to Finn's meticulously gathered intelligence, they knew the guild's schedule down to the minute. A routine inspection crew was due to assess the Great Bridge's stability before the evening's fireworks display, a cynical bit of theater to reassure the public. Dressed in ill-fitting guild uniforms stolen from a laundry service, their faces partially hidden by the deep hoods of workmen's cloaks, they fell into step with the real crew, their hearts hammering a frantic rhythm against their ribs that was utterly at odds with the festive music. Every step onto the bridge's wide deck felt like walking onto a stage under a blinding spotlight. The stone beneath their feet, which Lyra knew was poisoned at its core, felt deceptively solid. They moved in a tight group, trying to mimic the bored, shuffling gait of the other laborers, their eyes fixed forward, but their senses screaming, hyper-aware of every detail. Guild guards were posted at regular intervals along the parapets, their armor polished to a high gleam for the festival, their hands resting casually on the pommels of their swords. Each casual glance from one of these sentinels sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through Lyra. Was that guard looking a moment too long? Did he notice the tension in Ronan's shoulders, so different from the weary slouch of a seasoned laborer? The conflict was a silent, internal scream set against the city's boisterous laughter. It was a nerve-shredding game of stealth, where a single misplaced glance, a single nervous stumble, could unravel everything. The tension was a physical pressure in the air, so thick it was a miracle the revelers below couldn't see it distorting the light. The surreal contrast was almost unbearable. To their left, the city sprawled in a tapestry of light and music, a living monument to the very life they were fighting to save. Children chased each other through the crowds, their squeals of delight carrying on the wind. To their right, the dark, swirling waters of the river Etha flowed silently, a reminder of the impending collapse that lurked just beneath the surface of the celebration. The festive tunes from the city squares, meant to inspire joy, sounded to Lyra's ears like a mournful dirge, a funeral march for a city dancing on the edge of its own grave. Each cheerful note was a bitter accent to the grim purpose that propelled them forward, step by agonizing step, toward the central pylon. As they neared the massive stone pillar that was their target, a new kind of decision, crystallized in Lyra's mind. Their plan was a scalpel strike, precise and isolated. But what if it wasn't enough? What if the guild's response was faster than they anticipated, trapping them on the bridge before they could complete their work? They needed a distraction, something to divide their enemy's attention. Her thoughts turned to Elder Myron and the faction of rebel storm speakers holding the lower levels of the spire. They were former rivals, figures of an authority she had defied. Trusting them felt like a leap across a chasm. Closing her eyes for a fraction of a second as she walked, blocking out the carnival noise, Lyra did something she had never attempted. She focused her will not on the storm, but on the thin, invisible thread of connection that still bound her to the spire, to the familiar energy of her kin. She sent out a silent, psychic pulse, a wordless plea carrying a single, urgent image, the bridge, and a specific time, the moment the first firework was scheduled to burst in the sky. It was not a command, but an act of faith, a gamble that Myron would sense it, understand it, and have the courage to act. The stakes in that moment became as immediate and absolute as the stone beneath their feet. They were no longer lurking in the shadows or planning in secret chambers. They were walking directly into the lion's den, surrounded by thousands of people who would see them as terrorists if their disguises failed. The success of their entire rebellion, the very survival of Ethel, hinged on the next few minutes. Their lives were wagered on the precision of Finn's information, the strength of their nerve, and the hope that a silent prayer sent across the city would be answered. There was no turning back. The moment of truth was upon them, and the festive music swelled to a crescendo that felt like the world's final, taunting laugh. The moment they slipped away from the main inspection crew was a breath held too long, a subtle shift from the world of light and sound into a realm of shadows and silence. A heavy, iron-banded door, seemingly part of the bridge's decorative stonework, was their gateway. Finn, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of their bluff, produced a key he had lifted from a dozing quartermaster, and with a groan of protesting metal, the door swung inward. The festive music from the city square vanished as if cut by a knife, replaced by an absolute, suffocating quiet. A rush of cold, damp air washed over them, carrying a scent that was alien and wrong, not the moist earth of a cellar, but a dry, metallic chill, like the air inside a long-sealed tomb. They were descending into the belly of the beast. The maintenance shaft was a narrow, vertiginous ladder that dropped away into a darkness so profound it seemed to swallow the very light from their single, shielded lantern. The further they climbed down, the heavier the air became. It was not just cold, it was a cold that seeped into the bones, a deep, penetrating chill that felt less like an absence of warmth and more like an active, draining presence. The cheerful chaos of the festival above felt like a distant dream from another life. Here, the only reality was the rhythmic, nerve-shredding clang of their boots on the metal rungs, and the growing sense of a profound wrongness that permeated the very stone around them. Lyra's compass, which had been a reliable guide, became useless. The needle didn't just spin, it whipped in a frantic, continuous circle, a panicked dervish, confirming that the entire space was saturated with the unstable energy they sought. When their feet finally touched solid ground, they found themselves in a cavernous space that should not have existed. It was a chamber carved directly into the foundation of the central pylon, a hollow heart within the city's greatest strength. And at the center of this man-made cavern stood the source of the corruption. It was not a vein of ore or a pile of rocks. It was a single, massive, obsidian black pillar of void rock, seamlessly fused with the ordinary granite of the pylon. It pulsed. There was no light, no sound, but a rhythmic, sickening wave of energy radiated from it, a vibration that could be felt in their teeth and in the pit of their stomachs. The stone of the bridge around it was not just cracked, it was necrotic, crumbling into a fine, gray powder where it met the dark mass, as if the very essence of the rock was being consumed. This was no mere structural flaw, it was a cancer, and it was actively eating Ethel alive. The oppressive atmosphere created a conflict that was as much psychological as it was physical. The unnatural silence was a weight on their eardrums, making their own breathing sound thunderously loud. The cold was so intense it made their fingers clumsy and their thoughts sluggish. Every second they spent in that chamber felt like a lifetime. Their nerves stretched taut with the knowledge that, at any moment, their absence from the inspection crew could be discovered. Guards could be pouring down the ladder behind them, trapping them in this stone tomb. The tension was a race against a clock they could not see, a desperate scramble in a place that seemed designed to sap their will and their strength. They were not just working against time, they were working against the very environment which fought them with every chilling breath. Staring at the pulsating core, Lyra faced the most critical decision of the mission. The obvious brute force solution was to shatter the void rock. A well-placed strike with a hammer, a controlled blast of lightning. It would be a simple, definitive act of destruction. But as she extended her senses toward the dark mass, she understood the terrible truth. The void rock was not a foreign object lodged in the pylon. It had become the pylon's heart. Its energy was woven into the bridge's structural integrity in a twisted, parasitic symbiosis. Breaking it would be like severing a vital artery. The release of pent-up energy would be catastrophic, likely causing the entire central span to disintegrate instantaneously, plunging into the river and taking the festival crowds with it. They had come to save the city, not to trigger the very collapse they were trying to prevent. This realization forced a shift in strategy so radical it bordered on madness. If they could not destroy the corruption, they would have to heal it. Lyra's mind raced, pulling fragments of knowledge from the archives of echoes, from Ronan's lessons, from her own intimate connection to the storm. She recalled theories, mentioned only in the most speculative texts, about the nature of opposing energies, that negation was not the only path, that a powerful enough force of pure, balanced life could, in theory, overwhelm a negative one not by fighting it, but by transforming it. It was an untested, almost heretical idea. It meant using her storm power not as a weapon, but as a surgeon's scalpel, or more accurately, as a spiritual transfusion. She would have to channel the raw, chaotic energy of the storm and refine it into a precise, purifying wave to counteract the consuming void. It was a task that had no precedent for success. The stakes of their endeavor escalated from the desperately physical to the terrifyingly metaphysical. They were no longer just saboteurs planting explosives or rebels on a rescue mission. They were attempting a miracle. They were standing in a chamber of stone and silence, preparing to wage a war on a level that most people would never comprehend. a battle for the soul of the city's very foundation. The fate of Ethel, its thousands of celebrating citizens, and the future of the storm, speakers themselves now rested entirely on an untested theory from a forbidden text and the strength of one young woman's spirit. As Lyra stepped toward the pulsating black pillar, the light from their lone lantern seemed to weaken, the darkness around them growing deeper and more hungry, as if the void rock itself knew a challenge was coming and was preparing to swallow it whole. High above the city, at the very peak of the obsidian spire, the air grew thick and heavy, a pressure cooker of pent-up energy waiting for a single spark. That spark came from Elder Myron, with her small band of rebel storm speakers arrayed around her, their hands linked and their wills united. She did not merely call upon the storm, she gave it a target. Their focus was not the sky, but the sprawling festival grounds directly below the spire's towering shadow, with a collective surge of power that made the ancient stone of the peak vibrate. They pulled a tempest from the clear evening air. It began as a sudden, unnatural gust that tore banners from their poles and sent trays of food clattering. Within heartbeats, it escalated into a shrieking, localized hurricane, a vortex of wind and lashing rain that seemed to target the celebratory heart of the city with malicious intelligence. The cheerful music was drowned out by the roar of the gale and the screams of a panicked crowd scrambling for cover. It was a spectacle of pure, undeniable power, a message that could not be ignored. The diversion worked with brutal efficiency. From their vantage point on the bridge, Lyra and her team saw the immediate effect. The guild guards who had been patrolling the parapets with bored indifference suddenly snapped to attention, their heads whipping toward the chaos erupting at the base of the spire. Shouted orders echoed, and in a chaotic rush, the majority of the security force abandoned their posts, sprinting across the bridge toward the perceived, immediate threat. The path to the central pylon was now virtually clear, a testament to Myron's precise and devastating timing. However, this success came at a terrible and immediate cost. By unleashing such a blatant, aggressive use of storm magic upon the city itself, Myron had drawn more than just the guild's ire. She had committed an act of open rebellion against the Conclave's authority, directly challenging Elder Kalin's faction, which still advocated for order and tradition. The consequence was an eruption of a different kind of storm, a civil war within the sacred halls of the spire itself. The conflict was now a terrifying symphony, playing on two separate stages. As Lyra prepared to descend into the bridge's heart, the distant but unmistakable sounds of magical combat began to reach her ears. It was not the clean crack of lightning from a clear sky, but the discordant thunder of energies clashing against each other. She could hear the shriek of wind meeting a wall of solidified air, the percussive blast of concussive force spells. Each rumble and crash was a stark reminder that her allies, the men and women who had chosen to stand with her, were not just creating a distraction. They were fighting for their lives against their own former comrades. The knowledge was a heavy weight on her soul. Every second she spent on her ritual was a second bought with their blood and courage. The tension was no longer just about the success of her own mission, but about the survival of the people who had made it possible, a dual burden that threatened to fracture her concentration before she had even begun. With the way clear and the sounds of battle, a grim metronome counting down the time they had left, there was no room for hesitation. Lyra made the decision to begin, trusting that Myron and her followers could hold the line. She turned her back on the world above and faced the pulsating core of void rock, descending fully into the trance-like state the purification would require. Understanding the immense vulnerability this would create, Ronan did not need to be told what to do. Despite the pain from his wounded shoulder, he stood tall, his own weathered face set in a mask of grim determination. He barked orders to the handful of rebel acolytes and river folk who had accompanied them. They formed a tight, protective circle around Lyra, their bodies a living shield between her and the entrance to the chamber. Their weapons were not just swords and spears, but the smaller, more controlled applications of their gifts. A gust of wind to knock an arrow off course, a sudden mist to obscure an attacker's vision. They were the last line of defense, tasked with holding back any remaining guards who might investigate the open doorway. The stakes in that cold, dark chamber beneath the river could not have been higher. This was the ultimate, all-or-nothing gambit. The entire rebellion, the fugitive storm speakers, the marginalized river folk, the defector Finn, and the symbolic hope Lyra represented, was now fully committed. There were no more backups, no secondary plans, no avenues of retreat. Failure here meant more than just their personal capture or death. It would mean the certain fall of Ethel as the celestial alignment reached its peak and the void rock's energy surged beyond any hope of control. It would mean the utter annihilation of the storm speakers who had dared to defy fate, their order destroyed from within by civil war and from without by the catastrophe they failed to prevent. The very air in the chamber became a battlefield of competing energies. Crackling with the nascent power Lyra was drawing into herself, and the cold, hungry void radiating from the black stone. A palpable sense of an impending collision that would decide the destiny of everyone and everything above them. The world above, with its screaming wind and clashing spells, vanished from Lyra's awareness. Her entire being, every ounce of her spirit, was funneled into the point of contact between her outstretched hands and the cold, pulsating surface of the void rock. It was not like touching stone. It was like plunging her soul into a frozen, starless ocean, a depth of absolute nothingness that actively fought against the spark of her life. This was no longer a physical battle. It was a war on a metaphysical plane, a clash of fundamental principles. Her life force, vibrant and warm with memory and hope, was a single candle flame thrust into a gale of anti-existence. The void rock was not merely an object. It was a sentient hunger, an ancient emptiness that sought only to consume, to return everything to the silent, static void from which it came. She felt it immediately, a sucking cold that threatened to pull her consciousness apart. It was a pressure that sought to extinguish not just her power, but her very self, her memories, her emotions, the love she held for her friends, the image of the city she was fighting to save. It offered a seductive promise of an end to struggle, a final, quiet surrender. In that moment of extreme peril, her mind did not retreat into itself, but instead exploded outward, grasping for anchors. She saw Ronan's face, not as the weary mentor, but as the young man who had failed to save the Sky Realm, his regret now a beacon, warning her away from the same path. She felt the sturdy grip of Anya's hand, the pragmatic courage of the river folk, who had lost everything but still fought. She remembered the hopeful star she had placed in the sky, and the thousands of upturned faces in the city square, their lives a tapestry of joys and sorrows she had sworn to protect. These were not just thoughts, they were the very substance of her will, the fuel for her flickering flame. As she poured this energy into the void, the resistance became a physical reality in the world above. The great bridge, which had stood for so long as a symbol of unshakable progress, began to groan in protest. A deep, shuddering vibration ran through its entire length, a tremor far more violent than the one that had cracked the riverbank. Stones in the chamber around them shifted, and fine dust rained from the ceiling, stinging the eyes of Ronan and the others who formed their desperate defensive circle. Cracks like black lightning spiderwebbed across the granite walls. The external conflict was now a direct reflection of the internal one. The bridge was dying because the heart she was trying to heal was fighting back with the fury of a cornered beast. To anyone on the deck above, it must have seemed like the prophecy was fulfilling itself before their eyes. The cataclysm beginning not from the sky, but from within the city's greatest achievement. Lyra felt herself being overwhelmed. The memories she used as shields began to dim, their warmth stolen by the relentless cold. The faces of her friends grew hazy, their voices distant echoes. The void was winning. It was not a dramatic defeat, but a quiet fading, a dissolution of self into the infinite nothing. She was at the very brink of annihilation, her spirit stretched thinner than gossamer. In this final, desperate instant, a fundamental shift occurred within her. The lessons of the archives of echoes, Ronan's confession, her own journey, they all coalesced into a single, blinding understanding. She had been fighting the void as an enemy, trying to defeat it with pure, opposing force, just as the storm speakers of old had tried to fight the falls of their civilizations with denial and suppression. But you cannot defeat nothingness by attacking it. You can only overcome it by filling it. This was the climactic turning point, the culmination of every hardship and every lesson. Instead of resisting the pull, instead of fighting the emptiness, she made a choice that defied every instinct of self-preservation. She stopped fighting. She opened herself completely, accepting the void not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a part of the world's balance, a necessary silence that gave meaning to the sound, a potential that awaited form. But she did not surrender herself to it. Instead, she began to pour her essence into it, not as a weapon, but as a gift. She filled the consuming emptiness with the memory of Bram's weary eyes, finding the courage to speak. She filled it with the sensation of the sun on her face atop the obsidian spire. She filled it with the taste of the river folk's thin stew, a symbol of shared humanity. She filled it with the sound of a child's laughter from the festival, a note of pure, unbidden joy. She was not destroying the void. She was transforming it, using her hope and her love for life as a foundation upon which something new could be built. The shuddering of the bridge reached a deafening crescendo, a roar of protesting realities as two incompatible forces struggled for a single, defining moment to become one. The moment of transformation was not an explosion, but an unfolding, a silent bloom of energy that seemed to rewrite the very laws of the chamber. The wave of pure, silver light that erupted from Lyra did not strike the void rock with violence. It enveloped it like a gentle tide, soaking into the obsidian surface. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, the pulsating darkness began to change. The cold, hungry void at the stone's heart did not vanish, but it was filled. The absolute blackness softened, warming to a deep, steady gray, and then began to glow from within with a soft, pearlescent luminescence, like the first light of dawn seen through thick fog. The sinister energy that had leached the warmth from the air and the sound from their ears simply dissipated, not with a bang, but a sigh, replaced by a profound, stable calm. The very air felt heavier, more substantial, as if the chamber had been grounded to the center of the earth. Most miraculously, the violent shuddering that had threatened to tear the bridge apart ceased completely, the groaning stone falling into a sudden, profound silence that was more shocking than the noise that had preceded it. In the wake of that impossible quiet, the tension that had held them all in its grip for so long shattered, not into celebration, but into a stunned, breathless awe. The small band of rebels lowered their weapons, their defensive postures forgotten as they stared at the transformed core. The pillar of stone was no longer a cancerous growth, but a radiant, integrated part of the pylon, its light casting gentle, unwavering shadows on the walls. Ronan, his face pale with pain and exhaustion, looked from the stone to Lyra, who stood swaying on her feet, her entire body trembling from the spiritual expenditure. In his eyes was not just relief, but a kind of holy reverence. He had witnessed the fall of one civilization and spent a lifetime mourning it. Now, he was witnessing the redemption of another. The internal conflict that had defined his life, the battle between guilt and hope, was finally, truly resolved in that soft, steady glow. The metaphysical war was over, and healing had triumphed over annihilation. Lyra's knees buckled, but she did not fall. Anya, who had been freed in the chaos above and had fought her way down to them, was there in an instant, catching her with a strength born of shared struggle. The physical and emotional exhaustion was a weight threatening to pull Lyra into unconsciousness, but a new urgency flared within her. The battle below was won, but the war for the city's future was still raging in the streets and in the skies above the spire. The citizens were terrified, the storm speakers were divided and fighting, and the guild's lies still held power in the absence of the truth. To simply rest now, to hide their victory in the darkness, would be to waste the miracle they had just achieved. The danger had passed, but the fear remained, and fear was a tool the guild knew how to wield. Summoning the very last dregs of her strength, Lyra pushed herself upright, her voice a raspy but firm command in the quiet chamber. "We have to go up," she insisted. "We have to show them. We have to end this." This decision propelled them out of the foundational darkness and back toward the world of light and sound. Their ascent up the metal ladder was slow, a procession of the weary and the wounded, but it was filled with a purpose that lent them strength. As they pushed open the heavy door and stepped back onto the bridge's deck, the contrast was jarring. They emerged from the absolute silence of the chamber into the chaotic aftermath of the festival. The celebratory music had been replaced by the cries of the injured and the frantic shouts of confused citizens. The air was thick with dust from the tremors and the lingering energy of Myron's diversionary storm. The scene was one of panic and disarray, a city believing itself to be in its death throes. But the bridge beneath their feet was solid, unshaking, a fact that felt like a secret only they possessed. The stakes of their mission had now undergone a profound and irreversible shift. The immediate life or death threat to the entire population had been averted. The city of Ethel was physically saved, but in that salvation, a new, more complex battlefield was revealed. The political and social stakes were now immense. The guild, though its central deception had been foiled, still possessed its wealth and influence. The conclave was fractured, its authority in tatters. The people were a frightened, leaderless mob, ripe for manipulation. Their emergence from the depths of the bridge was not just a return to the surface. It was a transition from a struggle for survival to a struggle for the soul of the city. They carried with them not just the proof of their victory, but the immense responsibility of defining what came next. The soft, hopeful light from the chamber below was a beacon against the chaotic darkness of the night, a promise that the future was no longer written in the cold stone of prophecy, but was waiting to be shaped by the hands of those brave enough to grasp it. The heavy door to the maintenance shaft groaned open, and Lyra stepped back onto the bridge's deck. The cool night air a shocking contrast to the tomb, like silence below. She was supported by Anya and a limping Ronan, their faces gaunt with exhaustion, but in Lyra's hands she carried their impossible proof, the shard of void rock, now transformed. It no longer pulsed with a hungry darkness, but glowed with a gentle, steady luminescence, like a piece of the moon given form. As they held it aloft, its soft, silver light cut through the dust-choked air, a beacon of calm in the heart of the panic. The effect was instantaneous and profound. High above, at the peak of the obsidian spire, the violent, unnatural storm that Myron had conjured began to falter. The shrieking winds gentled into a whisper, the lashing rain softened to a mist, and the crackling energies of the magical duel between the Storm Speaker factions simply sputtered and died. The combatants, their hands still raised to strike, found their power fading, not by force, but by the quiet certainty that the reason for their fight had vanished. They looked down across the city to the small, battered group on the bridge, and in the gentle glow of the purified stone, they saw not rebels or fugitives, but saviors. In the streets below, the people of Ethel, who had been screaming and running from what they believed was their final hour, slowly stilled. The violent tremors had stopped as suddenly as they had begun. The bridge, the very symbol of their impending doom, stood firm and unshaken. All eyes turned to the source of the strange, peaceful light. They saw Lyra, her face etched with the price of her journey, standing with the river folk and the storm speakers who had fought for them. There were no grand speeches, no declarations of victory. The evidence was irrefutable. The guild's lies, so carefully constructed, evaporated in that single, silent moment. The grand narrative of stability and progress they had sold the city was exposed as a hollow fraud, while the terrifying prophecy they had dismissed was proven to be their salvation. The power of the merchant guild did not break in a clash of steel. It shattered in the hearts and minds of the populace, defeated by a truth too radiant to deny. On the spire, Elder Kalin watched the scene unfold, the fight gone out of him. He saw the citizens not bowing to a new ruler, but looking up with a dawning, collective understanding. He saw the young acolytes who had once revered him now gazing at Lyra with a respect that transcended tradition. He had staked his authority, his entire philosophy, on the idea that order and caution were the highest virtues. But the undeniable reality on the bridge, the solid stone, the calm air, the healed core, proved that true order could not be built on a foundation of lies. His defeat was not delivered by an enemy's hand, but by the quiet weight of his own misjudgment. He lowered his staff, a gesture of surrender, not to Myron or her rebels, but to the evidence itself. The external conflicts that had torn the city apart, the battles between Storm Speaker and Storm Speaker, between the people and the guild, simply ceased, leaving in their wake a fragile, hopeful silence. It was in this profound quiet that Lyra faced her most defining choice. She had the power, in that moment, to claim everything. The people would have followed her. The reformed Storm Speakers would have pledged their loyalty. She could have become the unquestioned leader of a new Ethel, a ruler born from prophecy and proven by deed. But as she looked out at the thousands of faces, she saw not subjects, but partners in a shared survival. She saw the weary relief in Myron's eyes and the humbled, chastened posture of Kalin. To seize power now would be to replace one form of control with another, to begin a new cycle of the very pride and isolation that had nearly destroyed them. Instead, she walked toward the gathered elders, her voice, though tired, carrying clearly across the space. She did not demand a throne. She proposed a council. She advocated for a new governing body that would include both Myron, representing the courage to change, and a humbled Kalin, representing the wisdom of tradition, tempered by hard-learned lessons. Her decision was not an abdication of responsibility, but the ultimate expression of it. She was advocating for unity and reform, for a system built not on a single voice, but on the collective wisdom of many, ensuring that no one person would ever again hold the power to silence a warning. As the first rays of the rising sun broke over the horizon, they illuminated a city forever changed. The scars of the night were everywhere. The collapsed section of Riverbank, the scorch marks from the magical battle, the lingering fear on people's faces. But the light also revealed something new. Citizens tentatively helping each other up, guild guards laying down their weapons without being ordered, Storm Speakers from opposing factions slowly, hesitantly, moving to aid each other's wounds. The stakes of the story had completed a fundamental shift. The immediate, desperate struggle for survival was over. Ethel was saved, but a new, more complex challenge had begun. The stakes were now about legacy, the kind of city that would rise from the rubble, the kind of order the Storm Speakers would become. The story concludes the mortal threat, but it throws open the door to the arduous, unglamorous work of building a better, more just future, a task that would require a different kind of courage altogether. The sun did not rise on a perfect victory, but on a city scarred, saved, and humbled, its future no longer written in stone, but waiting to be shaped by the hands of its people. In the quiet aftermath of the city's salvation, while others rushed to claim seats on the new ruling council or oversee the repairs to the Great Bridge, Lyra sought a different kind of restoration. She returned to the archives of echoes, but this time, she did not come as a student searching for answers in the silent testimonies of the dead. She came as a chronicler, with a story of her own to add to the endless shelves. The slate she chose was not one of the ancient, dark ones, but a fresh, smooth piece of stone, and in her hand, she held not a shard of lightning glass, but a simple, sturdy stylus. The work she began was methodical and solemn, a deliberate act of preservation that felt to her as vital as any ritual she had performed on the spire or beneath the bridge. This was not about shaping the future through force of will, but about securing it through the unassailable power of memory. Her account became the first volume of what would be known as the Chronicles of the Reforged Covenant. It was not a heroic epic that placed her at the center of a glorious legend. Instead, she wrote with the unflinching clarity of a witness, meticulously documenting the sequence of events from her first, terrifying vision on the summit to the final, desperate act of purification. She detailed the initial warnings that were dismissed as heresy, the Conclave's deadlock born from fear, and the corrosive influence of the merchant guild's greed. But she also recorded the moments of redemption, the fragile alliance with the river folk, Ronan's hard-won return from guilt, and the silent, crucial aid from Finn. Her chronicle was a map of failure and recovery, intended as a practical guide for future generations of storm speakers, emphasizing that their gift was not a privilege, but a profound moral responsibility that demanded vigilance, and when necessary, the courage to defy tradition itself. The primary conflict she faced in this new phase was subtle yet insidious, the temptation toward a comfortable amnesia, as the physical scars on the city began to heal with new stone and mortar. The memory of the pain and the fear started to fade. People wanted to move on, to forget the time they stood on the brink of annihilation. There was a powerful urge, even among some of the reformed storm speakers, to let the story soften at the edges, to transform it into a simpler tale of good triumphing over evil, a narrative that would be easier to tell and easier to hear. Lyra fought this complacency with every stroke of her stylus. She understood that a sanitized history would be a worthless one. The true lesson lay not in the victory, but in the precise nature of the mistakes that made victory so desperately necessary. This conviction guided her most important decision as a chronicler. She made a conscious choice to tell the story of Ethel's crisis, not as the journey of a lone heroine, but as a tapestry woven from the threads of many lives. She devoted entire chapters to Anya and the river folk, detailing their perspective from the city's forgotten underbelly, and arguing that no prophecy could be complete without understanding the ground-level truth of those who are often ignored. She included Finn's story, the defecting guard whose conscience was pricked by a prisoner's words, to illustrate that corruption is not always monolithic, and that change can come from within the most unexpected places. She wrote with deep respect about Ronan's past failure and his painful redemption, ensuring that the shame of the Zephyrin fall would serve as a cautionary tale rather than a hidden secret. And perhaps most controversially, she recorded the doubts and rigid caution of Elder Kalin with scrupulous fairness, not to vilify him, but to demonstrate how the best intentions, when coupled with an inflexible adherence to order, can become a dangerous obstacle to survival. She was building an archive of humility, proving that history is never made by one person alone, but by the complex interplay of countless choices, both courageous and flawed. The stakes of this meticulous work were as high as any she had faced. If the memory of the crisis were allowed to distort or fade, Ethel would be doomed to repeat it. The city's salvation would be temporary, a brief respite before the same patterns of pride, secrecy, and institutional blindness took root again. The chronicle itself, therefore, became the ultimate weapon against future falls. It was a shield against the arrogance that believes itself immune to history's lessons. Each word she etched was a bulwark against forgetfulness, a permanent record that would stand long after the people who lived through the events had turned to dust. In the profound silence of the archives, broken only by the soft, persistent scratch of her pen, Lyra was not merely recording the past. She was forging the single most important tool for the future, ensuring that the hard-won wisdom of near disaster would echo through the ages, a constant whisper of warning and hope for all who would listen. The wind that tousles Lyra's hair on the summit of the obsidian spire carries a different music now. It is no longer the sharp, keening wail that once seemed to scream of impending ruin, but a softer, more complex melody, humming with the sounds of the city rising from its trial below. She stands not as an outcast, but as a recognized master, a figure whose name is already weaving itself into the new myths of Ethel. Yet, the title she cherishes most is not master or savior, but chronicler. Her journey has come full circle, from the raw, terrified acolyte who scaled these stones seeking validation, to the wise woman who understands that the true power of a storm speaker lies not in the predicting, but in the preserving. The climb itself has not changed. The stone is as cold and treacherous as ever, but the climber has been utterly transformed. Her fears were forged into a quiet, unshakable certainty. Gazing down at Ethel, she does not see a city saved, but a city healing. The scars of the recent crisis are still visible. The repaired section of the riverbank is a lighter shade of earth. The great bridge, though stable, bears the subtle marks of its ordeal like lines on a weathered face. But there is a new vitality pulsing through the streets. The reconstruction is not merely about replacing stone and mortar. It is about building with intention. The new foundations are stronger, not just because better materials are being used, but because they are being laid with a collective memory of what happens when pride outweighs integrity. The shadows the city faced were not just external threats, but the internal darkness of greed and willful ignorance. By confronting those shadows openly, the people have inoculated themselves against a future where such evils can fester in secret again. The city's strength is now born of transparency, a lesson etched into its very infrastructure. This transformation is mirrored in the reformed covenant of the storm speakers themselves. The ancient order has been reborn from the fires of its own schism. Gone is the old doctrine of aloof observation, the idea that their role was to predict fate from a safe distance and deliver warnings to those in power, hoping to be heeded. The new understanding, forged in the desperate alliance between Myron's rebels, Ronan's hard-won wisdom, and the ground-level courage of the river folk, is one of active guardianship. They see now that to serve the people truly, they must sometimes challenge power itself. Their purpose is to be a voice for the voiceless, to speak the uncomfortable truths that rulers so often bury, and to stand as a bridge between the lofty visions of the sky and the gritty realities of the earth. They are no longer oracles in an ivory tower, but healers and sentinels woven into the fabric of the community. Lyra's personal sacrifices, the loss of her home, the betrayal of her mentors, the crushing weight of isolation, have not been in vain. They were the crucible in which this new legacy was forged. Every moment of doubt, every instance of having to choose between obedience and truth, contributed to a strength that is both compassionate and resilient. She knows, with a certainty that settles deep in her bones, that the storm that passed over Ethel was not unique. Other tempests will gather on the horizon for other civilizations. The cycle of growth, pride, and potential fall is as old as time itself. But what has changed is the existence of a guide, a testament against despair. The Chronicles she has begun, Those meticulous records filled with both failure and redemption will stand long after she is gone. They are not a history of inevitable doom, but a living argument for hope, a testament that a fall is not predestined for those who possess the courage to truly listen to the warnings, and, most importantly, the bravery to act upon them. The breeze shifts, carrying up from the city the distant, harmonious sound of hammers on stone and the hopeful voices of its people. It is a sound of continuity, of a story continuing rather than ending. Lyra turns from the view, her work for the day complete, and descends the spire. The path is familiar, but the future it leads to is unwritten. A story waiting to be told in the next volume of the Chronicles. A promise